With the amount of lethal aid that the US is delivering to Ukraine to help defend themselves against the ongoing Russian invasion, it's logical to ask, could the US conquer Russia on its own? To answer that, we need to take a closer look at both countries' militaries, compare their strengths and weaknesses, and get clear on who is the bravest and the baddest armed force out there. Starting off with a deep dive, let's talk about nuclear power. Here's the thing. We need to accept that comparing US and Russian military power will have to exclude the use of nuclear weapons by either side. Why? Well, the US and Russia have roughly equal parity in nuclear warheads, with reportedly 5,900 total operational nuclear warheads for Russia and 5,400 for the US. Included in these stockpiles, yep, it's a tie. Russia and the US each have about 1,600 active, deployed strategic nuclear warheads. However, these numbers are just best guesses, since neither country will confirm nor deny their active nuclear forces, and only rarely will they confirm where such weapons are being kept. It's scary to be kept in the dark on this topic, right? Well, it gets scarier. Apparently, Russia claims to have a working dead hand system in place, also known as the perimeter system, that will automatically launch Russia's nuclear forces if an attempted first strike is launched to decapitate Russian leadership. While this system is supposed to be offline under normal circumstances, it's not clear when Russia has this system set to on. It's quite likely that since 2014, during Russia's earlier invasion of eastern Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula, this system may have been continually online, in order to prevent a decapitating first strike by US forces. It gets worse. Putin apparently placed Russia's entire nuclear forces on high alert in February of 2022, following the invasion of Ukraine and NATO and the West's response to support the defenders. There is no indication that the high alert status has been revoked. In fact, as of March 29, 2023, President Putin has announced that Russia will no longer give advanced warning of their nuclear weapons tests, following their February announcement that they would no longer allow the US to inspect their nuclear weapons sites as part of the decades-old START weapons treaty. With all these unsettling red flags in place, let's shift gears and take a look at other aspects of the US and Russian militaries. Who do you think has the best army, budget, and weaponry? The short answer is, there really is no comparison. The US military is currently vastly superior to anything Russia can muster. Everything we've seen from the invasion of Ukraine so far shows that the Russian Army, Navy, and Air Force have been completely overrated by Western analysts and have been manhandled expertly by Ukraine's outnumbered but valiant defenders. What's left of Russia's once vaunted military is being chewed up faster than they can replace them. But it wasn't always this way. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the US had roughly equal conventional forces, at least in numbers. The USSR had an advantage in raw numbers of tanks and artillery, especially in the areas bordering Western Europe and its NATO member countries, while the US had a larger and more advanced Air Force, Navy, and Special Forces. But since the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, the two sides have grown steadily and dramatically apart in terms of the sophistication of their tanks and aircraft, the reliability of their state-of-the-art weapons systems, and their respective capability to project power into other regions and spheres of influence. For example, Russia currently has only one working aircraft carrier, an older, fuel oil-burning ship launched in 1985 named the Admiral Kuznetsov, which, oddly enough, was built in Ukraine. This ship has suffered a string of serious accidents, from shipboard fires to repair cranes falling on its flight deck during repairs. When it does travel, it never sails far from its home port without a seagoing tug to tow it back home. It isn't even in current deployment, having been in different dry docks undergoing continual repairs since 2018, and it's known to leave an incredibly dark trail of dense smoke due to an inability for its boilers to fully burn its low-grade fuel. The whole ship is an embarrassment to the world's navies, yet it's the largest capital ship Russia still has afloat, so they'll do anything to try and keep it going. You might see it back on the high seas in 2024, maybe. In comparison, the United States is completing its second carrier in the Ford class, the most advanced and largest aircraft carrier class in the world. The US Navy currently operates 11 carrier strike groups, each of which is built around a nuclear-powered carrier. Each of these strike groups incorporates multiple ships that includes Aegis-class carriers, nuclear-powered attack submarines, destroyers, minesweepers, and additional support and resupply ships. Each Ford-class carrier will be able to support more than 75 aircraft, including the latest 5th-generation aircraft, the F-35C, along with state-of-the-art drones, airborne warning and surveillance aircraft. These carrier strike groups allow the US to patrol the world's oceans and project air power far from the US mainland. Russia has no equivalent capability and likely never will. The same inequality exists in their respective air forces, and it's only widening. While the US has both the F-35 and F-22 fifth-generation stealth fighters, Russia's only close to but not quite fifth-gen fighter, the Su-57, can't deploy over Ukraine for fear of being shot down. Meanwhile, the US is already making progress on the NGAD, the next-generation air dominance system, which includes new weapons, advanced sensors, networking and battle management suites, redesigned jet engines, and innovative combat drones that will be designed around a truly groundbreaking 6th-gen fighter to replace the F-22, which, even though it's being replaced, still remains the best dogfighting combat aircraft in operation. The US Navy is also working on a 6th-gen carrier-based stealth fighter under the current program name FAXX. Prototypes may already be flying, and the current Navy budget has already earmarked over $9 billion in funding for further development. On the other side of the equation, Russia claims to be working on a 5th-gen plus fighter, the Mikoyan PAK-DP, also known as the MiG-41. But so far it barely exists in reduced-sized wind tunnel mock-ups, and may not be seen as a flying prototype until sometime in the mid-2030s. Then there are the respective tank forces. The US Abrams tank may not be the world's best. Some argue that spot is taken up by the Israeli Merkava, the German Leopard 2, or the British Challenger 2. But the Abrams has been battle-tested since the First Gulf War in 1990 and has been continually upgraded and improved. Currently, the Abrams M1A2 System Enhancement Package version 4, SEP version 4, will employ 3rd-generation 3-gen FLIR, forward-looking infrared advanced optics that allow tank commanders to identify and attack targets farther away than ever before. Of course, Russian fanboys will point to the much-vaunted T-14 Armata as the best tank in the world. Except, well, where to begin? The tank was designed around the A85-3 engine, a copy of an X-shaped German engine which was never designed for tank propulsion. The tank's electronics and computer controls suffer from a lack of advanced computer chips, which under Western sanctions has been a real Achilles heel for the Russian economy. Captured Russian drones show they are so desperate for computer chips that they've resorted to using stolen Swedish traffic cameras for their guts. Without a consistent supply of computer chips, there's no way Russia can mass-produce the Armata. That wasn't bad enough. The production company for the Armata, UVZ, is busy upgrading previously mothballed T-62s and supporting the overworked T-72B3 and T-90M assembly lines. Currently, any Armatas being assembled are being done by hand. That may work for limited production Rolls-Royces and Lamborghinis, but it doesn't bode well for the implementation of a mass-produced battlefield weapons platform. Without any Armatas in Ukraine, and with a greater reliance on more outdated and poorly retrofitted Soviet-era models, the Abrams is far and away better than the vast majority of the surviving Russian tank forces. I say surviving because as of March 2023, the Russians have lost, at a bare minimum, an astounding 1,900 main battle tanks. Everything from the upgraded but still outdated T-72s to around 58 of their more modern T-90s. This means that more than half of their country's entire pre-invasion active tank force has been destroyed or captured. And this number is only what's been positively verified by Western observers like the Oryx team of open-source analysts. According to the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies, the total could be anywhere from 20% to 40% higher. Russia is so desperate for replacement tanks that they're even bringing in not just the T-62s from their mothballed tank graveyards, but as of March 23, 2023, even some 75-year-old T-54s and 55s. That would be like the US bringing back its Korean War-era M47 and M48 patterns. The bad news doesn't stop there. Russia has also lost around 800 infantry fighting vehicles, lightly armored trucks and transports, 2,200 armored fighting vehicles like the various MBT, MBD, and BTR models, 230 mobile command posts and communication units, 300 engineering vehicles, 190 towed artillery pieces, 370 self-propelled artillery, 190 multiple rocket launchers (MLRS), 100 surface-to-air systems, 2,300 unarmored transports, jeeps, and other vehicles. Honestly, at this point, it's almost easier to count which tanks and vehicles Russia has left, rather than try to keep up with the ones they've lost. And again, all of this has happened not against NATO or the US directly, but against much smaller Ukraine, and in just over a year. The Russian Air Force, when it's deigned to make an appearance over the battlefield, has also suffered unusually high casualties. It's estimated that 6 to 8% of its active tactical combat aircraft have been destroyed, including around 15% of its pre-invasion multi-role and ground attack aircraft, including the more advanced Su-30SM and Su-34. Douglas Barry, a military aviation analyst at the IISS, believes at least 20 Su-34 strike aircraft have been lost, along with 1 or 2 of their top-of-the-line Su-35s. And if you're still counting, you can tack on a minimum of 80 combat helicopters. Russia's navy isn't doing any better. In April of 2022, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the cruiser Moskva, was sunk by Ukrainian drone attacks, though Russia at first claimed it was due to a fire started by careless smokers. Following that meme show, the frigate Admiral Makarov assumed the role of flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, but it was attacked less than a month later in May of 2022. It's not confirmed, but the Makarov might now be inoperable. All told, the Russian Navy has lost 18 ships of various sizes and has had to pull all of its ships of any value back from the western Black Sea due to fears of more air and sea drone attacks. Not a very good showing against a country that officially has no navy. Then there's the overall troop losses. According to several estimates, Russia has lost as many as 200,000 to 270,000 troops, either killed, wounded, or missing, or captured in the invasion of Ukraine. And with close to 2 million men of draftable age having left the country to avoid Putin's first conscription in 2022, those troops won't be easily replaced. Neither will the hundreds of trained pilots, nor the hundreds of highly trained elite paratroopers and special forces killed in the first days of the war in the failed attack on the Hostomel airport, and in the equally disastrous attempt to assassinate President Zelensky. And because the Russian army has never created an independent, think-for-yourself NCO cadre and must be led by higher leaders who do all the thinking for the frontline troops, an astounding 14 generals have been confirmed to have died in the fighting. As of just May of 2022, Moscow had admitted that they had lost more than 300 high-ranking officers, a third of them members of the senior staff, namely colonels, lieutenant colonels, and majors. And this is only from a single year of combat against what is arguably a second-tier military, though Ukraine is punching way above its weight class. There are several reasons why Russia's military is doing so poorly. Institutional kleptocracy. Somewhere between 30% and 40% of Russia's annual military budget is siphoned off by oligarchs, commanders, and even Putin himself, who has an estimated fortune of over $200 billion. You can't expect your tank's reactive armor to operate when someone claimed to buy the explosives but instead put egg carton cardboard into the pouches where the explosives are supposed to go. Outdated tactics. With the serious degradation of its military both in numbers and quality, Russia has come to rely more and more on World War I tactics, namely massed artillery barrages and human wave attacks. The Russian commanders issue top-down commands that often bear little to no awareness of the current battlefield's logistics. This stems in part from Russia's incapability of creating an educated and well-trained NCO corps, which all other Western nations rely on. The inability to adjust. Russia seems incapable of learning from its mistakes. It's fought battles where its tanks bunched up and became easy targets for Ukrainian artillery, aided by spotter drones, or simply rolled through minefields without any concern for the consequences. We'll discuss one such example later on, in the Battle of the Seversky Donets. This rigidity is another result of a lack of a properly trained NCO corps, who might be able to adjust avenues of attack and better coordinate tactics at the point of opposition. The only element of the Russian armed forces that Putin seems able to rely on is his nuclear arm. And as we've already agreed, we're not including these in our discussions, for now at least. But Putin continues to rattle his nuclear sabers every chance he gets, as if that's the only way he can keep NATO and the US from placing boots on the ground in Ukraine. But it's clear from the battlefield that Ukraine needs no additional troops, just the advanced weaponry and ammunition that is already flowing into the country as we speak. There are 3 recent battles that showcase Russia's surprising ineptitude in modern warfare. The Battle for Antonov Airport, February 24, 2022. Within hours of President Putin's announcement of his invasion of Ukraine, his special military operation, a coordinated effort was made to land paratroopers, known as the VDV, and other special forces at Kyiv's Antonov Airport, otherwise known as the Hostomel Airport, named for the city in which it's located. An estimated 30 to 40 Russian helicopters led the airborne invasion, supported by a handful of fighter aircraft. If it had been successful, this operation would have paved the way for dozens of large Il-76 troop transports to land. Those planes would have carried thousands of reinforcements and would have then occupied a vital region within 10 kilometers of Ukraine's capital. Instead, Ukrainian resistance met the first attackers, and after the initial surprise wore off and Ukrainian mechanized reinforcements arrived, they managed to encircle the airport and eliminate at least 200 of the VDV in just a few days. Meanwhile, Ukrainian artillery cratered the runway, rendering it useless for the planned follow-on landing of the Il-76 transports. The VDV troops held on for weeks, supported by a few tanks and other vehicles that had broken through Ukrainian resistance northwest of Kyiv and had managed to link up with the Russian forces around the airfield, some of which had scattered into the nearby towns of Irpin and Bucha. However, the main column of Russian tanks and reinforcements heading south from Belarus, numbering up to 15,000 troops, never made it to the airport and was stuck in a traffic jam more than 40 kilometers long. In this ill-conceived, poorly supported and mismanaged attack, Putin wasted the best of his elite paratroops, as well as his chance for a quick, decapitating strike on the Ukrainian capital. His miscalculations of the strength and coordination of Ukrainian resistance, combined with his overconfidence about his own military's performance, were merely previews of the disasters that would unfold during the rest of his invasion of Ukraine. The Battle of the Seversky Donets. The first year of the invasion of Ukraine has displayed time and again the lack of military coordination on the part of the Russian forces, as well as their inability to adapt to the changing military environment during the heat of battle. Time and again, Russian forces will encounter an ambush, a minefield, or simply a well-prepared defense, and rather than regroup and try a different avenue of attack, will simply plow mindlessly ahead, regardless of the losses. One such event that perfectly encapsulates all the problems Russia is having with modern warfare is the well-documented disaster known as the Battle of the Seversky Donets, which occurred the 5th through the 13th of May 2022. In an effort to force a crossing of the Donets River in northeastern Ukraine, a Russian battalion tactical group, BTG, numbering between 1,000 and 1,500 troops, supported by tanks, armored personnel carriers, APCs, and artillery, placed a group of pontoons across the river near the small city of Seversky. They began to send tanks and APCs to the western side, while calling up additional vehicles on the eastern side to prepare to have them cross as well. But Ukraine had advanced warning of this attack, possibly due to satellite surveillance supplied by the US. In preparation, the Ukrainian armed forces brought up both tanks and artillery, with spotter drones overhead. When around half of the vehicles had crossed, Ukrainian artillery began pounding the two pontoon bridges already in place, isolating the forces that had already crossed. They also pounded the now massed vehicle pileup on the far side of the river, destroying a vast number of frontline combat vehicles. Rather than give up against a prepared and alert defensive formation, Russian commanders just continued to feed more forces into the cauldron. Some Russian military bloggers went beyond calling these decisions inept and suicidal and deemed them instead to be sabotage. When the surviving units finally pulled back the following week, Russia had lost over 70 tanks and other vehicles, and by some accounts more than 1,000 troops killed, wounded and missing. Retired British Major General Mick Ryan estimated that the defeat likely resulted in not just a BTG, but probably an entire brigade, losing a large part of its combat power. While most Western militaries would see such a calamity as a reason to learn from such mistakes, the Russian command structure doesn't seem to know how to make adjustments. Additional major defeats where Russia seemed heedless of massive casualties occurred at regular intervals across the Ukrainian battlefield, including Kherson, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and Volodar, not to mention the estimated 30 to 50,000 casualties Russia may have suffered in their months-long struggle to capture the fortified region around Bakhmut. Many observers will say that the Russian-Ukrainian war might not be a fair comparison to a possible Russian-US military encounter. Isn't there some event that would provide a better metric to compare the opposing militaries? As a matter of fact, there is. The so-called Battle for the Konoko Fields, also known as the Battle of Kashan, which occurred in Syria in 2018. This was the first hot encounter between US and Russian forces since the Cold War. The US had stationed a handful of US Marines and Army Special Forces about 5 miles east of the Euphrates River, close to a vital oil drilling and pumping station in eastern Syria to help support a small group of Syrian Democratic Forces (SDF) fighters, also defending the site primarily against ISIS threats in the region. Russian and US forces had previously agreed that a nominal dividing line between the two forces would be the Euphrates River. They had even set up a special hotline between the two areas' command units to make sure there wouldn't be any confusion on the ground, as the Russian troops were also ostensibly opposed to ISIS at the time. At around 5 a.m. on February 7, 2018, a force of some 250 mixed Russian Wagner mercenaries and Syrian pro-government militia attempted to cross the Euphrates southwest of Qashm. US forces fired a few artillery rounds to warn them off, and they did pull back. But later in the evening around 10 p.m., the US troops were surprised to detect a column of Russian T-72 tanks and support vehicles, along with as many as 500 soldiers, heading towards their position from the east side of the Euphrates. Sporadic artillery fire and mortar fire began to hit their positions as well. The US troops followed procedure and contacted their opposite numbers using the predetermined hotline, but the Russian commanders assured them that there were no Russian troops in the area. With that reassurance, the US troops called in massive air and artillery support involving F-15E and F-22 fighter jets, B-52 bombers, AC-130 gunships, AH-64 Apache attack helicopters, MQ-9 Reaper and RQ-7B Shadow drones, in addition to M777 howitzer artillery and M142 HIMARS rockets. The Russian and Syrian forces never got to within rifle range of their US targets. 4 hours later, when the fighting was over, more than 100 of the attacking forces had been killed, though some estimates put that loss at closer to 330. The only casualties on the US SDF side was a single wounded SDF soldier. The lopsided nature of the encounter, due to primarily the overwhelming and accurately directed air and artillery strikes supplied by the US, underscored the uneven nature of the current US and Russian military forces, as well as their relative abilities to use combined arms in a coordinated fashion. The massive response was also seen as a deliberate warning to Russia not to take the US or their allies lightly. That leads us inescapably to another interesting question. Could the US on its own invade and conquer the country of Russia? Alternatively, could the US, with NATO's help, conquer Russia? Bluntly, right now there's no way the US, even with NATO's help, could physically invade and conquer Russia. Even if Russia failed to use their nukes, and you can be certain they would, there's simply no way the vast country of Russia, stretching through 11 time zones, could ever be fully occupied and pacified. Hold on though, let's break this answer down and then we can talk about some other ways the US could possibly, actually, very probably destroy Russia. It's becoming clear in the modern age that no moderately well-supplied country would be able to be occupied and defeated as long as their people maintained the will to fight. A perfect example is the relatively tiny country of Vietnam. They were one of the first countries to soundly defeat the Mongol Empire in the 13th century and resisted French occupation right up until the Japanese invaded them in 1940. After the fall of Japan in 1945, they went on the offensive to drive the French out of their country. And when they were successful and the US tried to defend the area of South Vietnam, they fought for more than a decade before driving the US out as well, despite suffering as many as 1 million casualties. Cambodia next thought they could occupy Vietnam's Mekong Delta, but in a mere 2 weeks, the Vietnamese routed the attackers and occupied the capital, Phnom Penh, which they held until 1988. China then invaded, thinking that they could impose their will on the ruling Vietnamese government. But the Vietnamese went toe-to-toe with the mighty Chinese army and after some brief but intense fighting, managed to force them to withdraw, though China considered the event merely a short, punitive expedition. Such determination to defend one's homeland would undoubtedly be faced in Russia as well, but of an order of magnitude far greater. Many segments of Russia see the current invasion of Ukraine and the implied aim of NATO to hang a strategic defeat around Putin's neck as one of an existential crisis for their country. Since Russian media is nothing more than an echo chamber for their dictator-in-chief, most commentators mirror Putin's own comments when he says that in light of such a defeat, "I do not even know if such an ethnic group as the Russian people will be able to survive in the form in which it exists today." You can expect that, just as they did with their Herculean efforts to defend their country against the onslaught of Nazi Germany in World War II, Russia will fight on against any invasion, no matter the costs, the consequences, or the forces arrayed against them. They might even find a willing ally in China, who has been eyeing sections of Russia's Far East territories around Vladivostok that as recently as the 1850s were part of Greater China. it's entirely possible that China would be willing to help support the defense of Russia in exchange for what they currently consider historical Chinese territory. There is evidence that China has decided it's in their best interest to keep Russia as an intact nation in order to divide Western opposition. Both countries share an intense dislike of what they perceived as US hegemony throughout the world, and now that Russia has seen its oil and natural gas outlets in the West curtailed by sanctions, by necessity, they've had to turn to China and India as their two primary sources for exploiting petrochemicals. Even closer cooperation in the future is only inevitable. But wait, there's one more option. What if the US managed to topple the Russian government? This may be the trickiest of the three topics to answer. In short, yes, the US could probably topple the Putin government at any time if they wanted to. There was a recent event that showcased just how precise US strikes have become, an event that may have led Putin to decide to travel in a special armored train and to spend much of his time in isolated bunkers in Siberia, far from the active front lines. On August 2, 2022, the US sent a pair of specially modified Hellfire missiles to take out Ayman al-Zawahiri, one of the al-Qaeda leaders responsible for planning various attacks on US and Western targets, including the 9/11 attacks, the bombing of the USS Cole, multiple bombings of US embassies in Africa, and others. He was tracked to a residence in Kabul, in the middle of a densely populated area. But the two drones were so precise that the US claimed Zawahiri was the only casualty of the operation. According to published reports, he was taken out while he stood on the second-floor balcony of the residence with the missiles equipped with Ginsu knife-like projections. The strike was publicized in a series of press conferences, with additional US government officials warning that no matter how long it takes, no matter where you hide, if you are a threat to our people, the United States will find you and take you out. No doubt Putin took that threat seriously. But US military and diplomatic policy has matured since the 1950s and 60s, when the CIA routinely toppled governments, many of them democratically elected, in countries like Iran, South Vietnam, Chile, Guatemala, the Congo, and others. Nowadays, the US prefers to let its military-industrial complex do the talking, such as when they toppled Saddam's regime in Iraq. In retrospect, despite the overwhelming military victory the US achieved, the end result was ultimately seen by many as seriously flawed, as the US had no plan to replace the removed Iraqi government with any kind of stable and reliable replacement. And that may be the one main reason why the US doesn't want to topple the Putin dictatorship. There are fears that whoever might replace him could be far worse. The one element of his arsenal that Putin has dared not yet use is his nuclear arsenal. He probably knows that as long as he doesn't employ nukes, then the West will worry he's the only thing holding back a massive nuclear war. He's betting that the US and the West will worry that whoever comes next might not hold back. And so, we've come full circle. It's clear that the one ace in the hole that Russia still holds onto is its nuclear deterrent. Putin dare not use them, for fear that doing so will unleash a horrific response from the West. But Putin has to threaten to use them in fear that their possible use is the only thing keeping NATO from sending actual troops to drive the Russian invaders out of Ukraine. And the West dare not take Putin out directly, for fear that his replacement might be willing to use nukes in an act of suicidal revenge. And so the world balances on a precarious knife's edge, closer to a nuclear holocaust than we've been since the Cuban Missile Crisis of the early 1960s. It would be best if all sides could take one giant step back from the precipice, but Putin seems incapable of backing down, and the brave Ukrainians are determined to take their country back, as well they should. The most likely outcome is that some oligarch will find a willing accomplice in Putin's cook staff, and the Russian president will succumb to a bout of severe intestinal distress, following which some level-headed replacement will endeavor to repair the massive damage Putin's done both to Ukraine and to his own country. At least, that's what many sane people hope. Don't forget, before he was the leader of the Wagner Group, the oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin had a very special nickname, Putin's chef. But what do you think? Could the US military conquer Russia all on its own? How would they do it? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Hour 0. Sitting in his office surrounded by his most trusted advisors, Xi Jinping feels ready. Over the past decade or more, he's spent billions upon billions modernizing China's military. His nation now has nuclear weapons, around 500 of them, and he's built one of the world's largest navies. Add to that the fact that China's military has more active members than any other nation, with 2.35 million people to call on. He's going to bring war to the United States. But to do so, he has to carefully coordinate attacks throughout the Pacific. He knows that the United States has bases in Japan and South Korea, around 190 in those two countries alone, and a powerful navy that, though smaller than his, packs a lot more firepower. A full frontal assault on the United States without taking care of those problems first would be suicide. He needs to secure the Pacific, giving China a route toward the American mainland as a priority. His attack doesn't begin with missile launches. It starts on the cyber front. For years, China has been working on cyber technology that would allow it to hack into American infrastructure and military defense systems, limiting America's response to an attack in the process. On occasion, China gets caught out. In December 2023, for instance, the United States conducted an operation to disrupt a network of small office home office or SOHO routers that China had taken control of using the KV botnet to mask its hacking activities. That was unfortunate for Xi, but it won't stop the first stage of his attack. Xi gives the okay and dozens of cyber attacks begin. Chinese hackers work feverishly, targeting American water systems, electrical grids, and communication systems, with a special focus on any that are located near key military installations. Further attacks take place within the networks of companies that provide critical services to America's military, as well as attacks on systems and transportation methods that will be used by the United States to deliver aid to Taiwan in the case of a Chinese invasion. That last step is critical. To reach the United States, China has to secure a passage through the Pacific. Taiwan, which China has claimed for decades should be part of the People's Republic anyway, is chosen as the main target. By securing that island, China can break through the nations in the Pacific that are allied to the United States, including Japan and South Korea, and clear its route to the American mainland. Hour 1. The United States is scrambling. It's no stranger to Chinese hackers, but it's never faced an operation of this scale before. The country's success against Volt Typhoon, the elite group of Chinese hackers that were responsible for the KV botnet attacks mentioned earlier, revealed that China has its fingers in major networks. Rail, mass transit, maritime, water, and pipeline systems were all under threat. And though Volt Tycoon has been mostly eradicated, the sheer scale of the disruption occurring in the US reveals that it was far from the only hacker group China had in play. America is left chasing shadows, at least for a couple of hours, which is all China needs to start the next stage of its assault. Xi Jinping gives the okay for the next and boldest part of its strategy: activating the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, or PLARF. The group has around 120,000 members, who combine to operate 6 known ballistic missile bases throughout China. However, the PLARF's real strength lies in the sheer number of missiles it has at its disposal. Recent estimates from the US Naval Institute place the number at somewhere around 4,000, all of which are capable of targeting ships moving at sea in addition to static land-based targets. Both capabilities will be needed by Xi. In arranging this attack, he's had to make some difficult decisions. He knew that a launch against Taiwan was inevitable, and the island nation became his first target. A missile barrage begins, with air support being provided by the recently upgraded bases at Longqian, Jiangsu, and Wuhan. All three are supporting China with fleets of Shenyang J-16 fighters, launching missiles of their own while engaging Taiwanese defenses in the air. The tougher attacks focus on the US Pacific Fleet. Numbering around 200 ships, along with 1,500 aircraft and 150,000 military personnel, that fleet is the biggest barrier that stands in the way of Xi's ambitions to invade the United States. It covers almost half of the world's surface, stretching from Antarctica to the Arctic Circle, taking in the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean in the process. Xi can't hit everything in that fleet, but his goal is to strategically weaken the fleet in the early hours of his new war, eliminating America's ability to rapidly respond to his actions. To do that, he needs a 3-pronged missile attack. First, he has to engage the naval bases the United States has set up in Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. It's a risky move. Any missile strike on these nations will surely cause collateral damage, potentially bringing all 3 of them into the war in support of the US. But failure to strike now means leaving nearly 200 bases ready to launch an immediate counterattack supported by around 79,000 troops. Xi can't take that risk. Hordes of Dongfeng 26 or DF-26 missiles are launched towards America's bases in Japan and South Korea. Each missile has a range of 2,485 miles, easily ensuring they can reach their targets. They're accompanied by shorter-range missiles, such as the DF-16, for a simple reason. Xi needs his DF-26s for attacks further afield. Those very missiles are also part of the second part of China's missile barrage, attacking closer to the United States. More are sent flying toward Guam, targeting the Andersen Air Force Base in Yago, as well as Naval Base Guam in Santa Rita. Xi also unleashes the new jewel in China's missile crown to strike Hawaii. The DF-27 is a hypersonic missile that can just about reach America's east coast and is capable of evading US missile defenses. It'll be Xi's chief weapon when attacking the American mainland, at least during the early stages of the war. Finally, the third strike, attacking American ships that are currently in the Pacific. Chief among the targets will be the small fleet of cruisers America has in the water near China, including the USS Shiloh and USS Mobile Bay. All told, there are 9 of these ships, all packed with heavy armaments and strong anti-air defenses that China hopes to either eliminate or damage heavily. Secondary targets include the much larger fleet of US Navy destroyers, which pack less of a punch than the country's cruisers but will still be enough to cause serious damage to the Chinese fleet if they're allowed to go unchecked. There are dozens to target, and Xi knows that he won't be able to take out all of them. But the more he can destroy with missiles now, the easier he'll find his invasion of Taiwan and subsequent passage to America. However, Xi's missiles won't have clear paths to their target. Though his cyber attacks have left the United States scrambling, it hasn't shut down the country's missile defense systems. America's DSP satellites, overseen by its Space Force, easily detect China's missile launches, giving President Joe Biden time to organize the country's defenses. Chief among these will be its ground-based interceptors, or GBIs, of which there are currently 44 active in the United States. Most of these systems, 40, are stationed in Alaska, though they're still capable of destroying intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, traveling at around 15,000 miles per hour. The other 4 are stationed in California, much closer to China's Hawaiian targets, and will be responsible for providing most of America's defenses against China's missile barrage. There's just one problem. What if any of the missiles contain nuclear warheads? Biden consults his advisors, who conclude that possibility is unlikely. American satellites show that the missiles are on course to hit its Pacific bases and Hawaii, suggesting a conventional strike. If Xi were going nuclear, his ICBMs would be on their way to Washington and other key strategic locations in the American mainland. Right now, the strategy is clear: evacuate troops from the anticipated strike zones and hunker down. A counterattack will come, but at present, the US has to rely on its missile defense systems. Across the Pacific, Xi watches and waits as the first of his missile barrages travel toward their targets in Japan and South Korea. Both have activated their missile defense systems to guard America's bases, with the platform they rolled out alongside the US toward the end of 2023, giving them advance notice of the missiles China has launched. Many get shot out of the sky, falling harmlessly into the Pacific, but the sheer number of Chinese missiles overwhelms the defenses. Okinawa is practically destroyed. As home to most of America's overseas military in Japan, it was the chief target of these strikes. At the Kadena Air Base, missiles rained down on F-15 Eagle fighters, E-3 Sentry planes, and KC-135 Stratotankers. The latter are especially important targets. They'll limit America's ability to refuel its aircraft in the air, restricting them to using the bases that China is so steadfastly attacking. The strike could be considered a success, killing thousands of American troops in the process. But Xi knows the bases aren't fully out of commission. He can't launch a ground-based invasion just yet, meaning the surviving crews at these bases will be able to rebuild quickly enough to continue to serve as launching points for the US Air Force. That's okay. He only needs them down for a few days. More missiles make their way toward cruisers and destroyers that the US has stationed in the Pacific. These ships are a little harder to strike, not least because they're not remaining still. Orders from American command have told all to start moving in erratic patterns, hoping to send Chinese missiles off course in the process. The tactic works in some cases, though not in others. China is successful in cutting down about half of America's cruisers, as well as several dozen destroyers. Again, a qualified success for Xi. A few minutes later, China's DF-27 and DF-26 missiles are drawing nearer to Hawaii. Dozens are shot out of the sky by California's missile defense systems, but they can't provide complete coverage. Many more break through, striking ships including the USS Frank E. Peterson and USS Hopper. Xi had hoped his strike would also take out at least some of the 13 submarines stationed in Hawaii, but no such luck. Even with his cyber attacks wreaking havoc, the commanders and crews of those submarines received orders to submerge underwater, safe from the missile barrage, until the US was ready to fight back. By the end of the first few hours of the conflict, China has expended nearly a quarter of its 4,000 missiles. It has wreaked devastation on the American bases in Asia, though at the cost of drawing Japan and South Korea into Xi's war. America's Pacific Fleet has been severely weakened, with Xi's cyber attacks also limiting the speed in which the US can respond to what he's going to do next. The strike's success wasn't total, but it was enough. Day 2. Having bought himself some time with his attack on the United States, leaving his main enemy in a temporary state of disarray, Xi can focus on his immediate target, Taiwan. China has spent the last day battering Taiwan with short-range missiles. The barrage has been successful in taking out several targets, including the smaller islands surrounding Taiwan, but it's also faced a steadfast defense from the US-made Patriot air defense system stationed on the island, as well as Taiwan's own Skybow surface-to-air ballistic missile defense systems. Still, the barrage will have to end soon, if only because Xi wants to send ground troops in to take the island. He can't risk killing his own people in friendly fire situations. After a 24-hour bombardment in which China expends hundreds of missiles, Xi assesses the damage he's caused. Crucially, his attacks on America's overseas bases, as well as America itself, will delay its navy in reaching the Taiwan Strait, and the missiles he's fired at Taiwan have severely weakened its naval defenses, while fighter planes from Longqian, Jiangsu, and Huan keep the country's air force occupied. He feels ready to start landing troops on the Taiwanese mainland, but therein he finds a problem. His landing options are limited. That's partially due to the actions of Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen. She's been preparing for an attack from China for several months, especially in the wake of Beijing growing bolder by conducting military and naval operations in the Taiwan Strait. As soon as the missiles started flying, Tsai sent orders to defensive positions on both sides of the island. To the east, Taiwan benefits from having an extensive network of cliffs. Tsai anticipates that Xi will look to blockade that side of the island with his navy, but is unlikely to launch a full invasion from the east. Still, soldiers are placed on alert, telling them to prepare to fight against ground troops that might try to climb the cliffs, which have gradients of at least 15%. If need be, those troops will receive orders to destroy the routes built through the cliffs that lead to the mainland. Her main focus lies in Taiwan's west. As the coast closest to China, it's going to be the point of ingress into the island. Tsai places all 15 major ports and harbors on that coast on high alert, with orders for their destruction in place if China's forces get near. Tsai can't afford to allow China to set up a naval presence on the island itself if it manages to invade. Then there are Taiwan's beaches. All are heavily fortified, with any Chinese troops that manage to land having to make their way through scores of barbed wire-laden defenses just to achieve any hope of reaching the roads that lead to Taipei. The waters leading to most of those beaches are less than 50 feet deep, meaning China can't land troops en masse. It must take them most of the way before ferrying them across in smaller vessels, all while being subjected to missile fire from Taiwan. Those waters are also packed with shallow mines, with the beaches also containing anti-landing spikes that will prevent China's tanks from making inroads. And if worst comes to worst, Tsai can collapse the roads leading into Taipei from the west, forcing Chinese troops to navigate challenging terrain if they ever hope to reach Taiwan's capital. Tsai is going to make this a war of attrition, and that spells bad news for Xi. Day 3. The United States is almost ready to counter the initial Chinese offensive. But before it does, Biden puts on his diplomatic hat as he prepares to exploit a key weakness in Xi's plan. One of China's biggest challenges in the war is economic. The country relies heavily on importing goods, spending $2.56 trillion in 2023 alone. Biden has spent the last 3 days organizing heavy sanctions against China, with America's network of allies finally paying off. China will not only struggle to import goods and equipment from the United States, but it'll also be cut off from its European trade partners, all agree to not sell to or buy from China, essentially creating a blockade for as long as the war lasts. That blockade extends to oil. China imports 11.8 million barrels of oil per day to keep itself running. Much of that oil comes from Russia, which is now responsible for about 19% of the oil China buys annually. However, the other 81% comes from countries like Saudi Arabia, which are allied to the United States. Leveraging diplomatic pressure, as well as the concerns that other Asian nations such as Saudi Arabia have related to Chinese expansion, Biden is able to cut off most of the oil reaching China. Yes, Russia will supply Xi, though it isn't able to cover the massive shortfall that results from America's sanctions. And given Putin's war in Ukraine, He also can't risk Russia's trade with other countries for the sake of solely supporting China, especially given that he faces his own sanctions. Xi didn't expect this. Now he faces a shutdown. China has to defeat the United States in a matter of months, or else its resources will dwindle to the point where it's practically starved out of the fight that it started. Day 4. With sanctions in place and trade routes in the process of being cut off, Biden's next move is to speak to his allies in NATO. After all, China directly attacked America on its own soil by launching missiles at Hawaii. It also attacked America-owned military bases overseas, which would also constitute an attack on the US. All of this plays in Biden's favor for one reason: Article 5 of the NATO Charter. According to this article, if any NATO ally or member nation is the victim of an armed attack by another country, every other NATO member will consider this an act of violence against themselves. In short, China's attack on the United States has brought most of Europe into the fold. Biden has been cooperating with NATO members from the moment he detected China's missiles. Collectively, that makes him ready to utilize the power of 31 nations, including what's left of the United States defenses. The focal point of the counterattack is obvious: the Taiwan Strait. Xi has failed to take Taiwan with his missile barrage and now faces an extended conflict in which he's losing thousands of troops every day to his attempts to land on Taiwanese beaches. Even if he manages to break through Taiwan's defenses by simply throwing sheer numbers at the island, his troops will face an urban warfare campaign that will see them fight tooth and nail for every street they manage to claim. Xi didn't expect this. And this war of attrition all adds up to time that the US and its allies can take to prepare an attack. The strategy is to combine America's naval resources with those of its NATO allies, as well as the navies of South Korea, Japan, and Australia. The latter will also be a focal point of the counterattack, as China neglected to destroy the bases America has set up in Australia. The United States sends a fleet of ships, including most of its stock of 11 aircraft carriers, toward the Taiwan Strait. They're accompanied by one of the UK's aircraft carriers, the HMS Queen Elizabeth, loaded with Typhoon FGR-4 and F-35B Lightning jets. Similar support comes from Canada, which commits half of its 12 frigates to the American cause, as well as Japan, which sends most of its fleet of 36 destroyers. South Korea hesitates. It's happy to support the US in any way that it can, but it also has to be wary of North Korea, which could see China's attack as an opportunity for it to start a war with its southern neighbor. If South Korea commits its naval or aerial resources to America now, it leaves itself open to attack. Biden understands this, resulting in South Korea's role being to keep watch over North Korea to ensure it doesn't get involved in the conflict. And now the US has an allied fighting force that's capable of fighting against China in the sea or air. The fleet sets sail. Week 2. Xi has been bombarding Taiwan to no avail. Every attempt to land ground troops on Taiwan's beaches is met with missile strikes and fierce beach combat. Yes, he's slowly whittling away at those defenses, but for each victory he achieves, a road is destroyed or a tunnel collapsed by Taiwan, forcing his troops to divert over difficult terrain to get to Taipei. The few who managed to reach Taiwan's capital have been destroyed in urban warfare. This was supposed to be a quick victory. It had to be. Every day that China doesn't control Taiwan is another day in which American counteroffensives draw nearer. Finally, 2 weeks after his missile launches, Xi faces the prospect of American naval and aerial assets reaching the Taiwan Strait. Worse yet, they're supported by NATO and Japan, neither of which wants to see China gain more influence, be it in the Pacific or the Americas. Worse yet for China, its navy, though larger than America's, doesn't compare in terms of sheer firepower. Though Xi was successful in destroying almost 24 of America's destroyers in his missile barrage, that still leaves 68 to contend with, around 20 more than China has. And although China has more corvettes and patrol boats, neither will withstand the combined naval firepower being brought into the Taiwan Strait. Worse yet for Xi, America has an ace in the hole: its Rapid Dragon tactic. Over the past couple of years, the United States has been retrofitting some of its cargo aircraft so they're capable of dropping pallets of long-range missiles. Each pallet can be stocked up with 30 AGM-158 JASSM cruise missiles, which have a range of between 229 and 1,118 miles, depending on which version of the missile is launched. Stacked into America's MC-130J aircraft, which Xi didn't target as he didn't believe them to be a threat, these pallets start raining cruise missiles down onto the Taiwan Strait. Those missiles serve two purposes. If they hit a Chinese ship, their 990-pound WDU-42B penetrator warheads can easily destroy most targets. But even if they fail to hit, such a large barrage of missiles launched simultaneously will confuse the missile defense systems built into China's larger warships, as well as those in the 3 air bases that are the launching point for China's fighter jets. While the missile defenses are focused on a flurry of JASSM cruise missiles, more targeted strikes can take out targets. The Allied forces turn the tide in the Taiwan Strait. Month 2. Xi has lost the clear passage into Taiwan that he'd established during his initial invasion. He's still getting troops onto the mainland, though each landing is subjected to Taiwanese defenses along with assaults from the US and its allies' navies. Worse yet, he's lost air superiority. In truth, he never really had it. Taiwan's 142 F-16 fighter jets, many of which have been upgraded, may be technologically inferior to China's J-20s. The Infrared Search and Track, or IRST, built into the J-20s means that it's far more capable of tracking and eliminating a target than the F-16. But Tsai knew this, and knew that support was coming from the US. She's used her F-16s to delay rather than defeat China, just as she's used her beach and urban warfare tactics to keep China from sending hundreds of thousands of troops into Taipei. Now, the US and NATO are in the Taiwan Strait, and they're pushing Chinese forces back to their home country. Constant missile barrages on the Longqian, Jiangsu, and Huan air bases have rendered them practically unusable, making it a struggle for China to get new fighters into the air as quickly as it had managed before. America's aircraft carriers, of which it brings 8 to the Taiwan Strait, can each hold around 75 fighters, bringing the Allied forces to a total of 600 when at full capacity. Add to that the Rapid Dragon strategy, and America and its allies are shutting down every attack China attempts. It's not long before America's Navy cuts off the passage into Taiwan. Cut off from their target, China's naval and air forces begin a retreat, leaving the few thousand Chinese troops still in Taiwan stranded. They'll be picked off by Taiwan's forces in Taipei, assuming they get there. And with the US now firmly entrenched in the Taiwan Strait, it's able to land troops on the island's beaches to attack the remnants of China's forces from the rear. It's a lethal pincer movement that soon puts paid to Xi's invasion. Still, it hasn't all been clear sailing for the US. China has managed to use its strong submarine fleet, with its 6 Shang-class nuclear submarines leading the way, to take out 2 of America's aircraft carriers. It's a difficult loss, especially given that those carriers housed about 150 fighters between them. But America's submarines are just as lethal. Though it has fewer submarines than China, around 60 to China's 78, its crews are better trained and have fewer targets to strike. Both of China's aircraft carriers, brought into the conflict due to the American assaults on its air bases, are taken out, minimizing China's impact from the air. Xi has to face a very real possibility. He's about to lose this war. Month 3. China has stubbornly refused to give in to the overwhelming force being applied to it. The country's navy lies in tatters, with only a fleet of patrol boats guarding its coast to back the few corvettes and frigates it has left. Xi has called his ships back, anticipating an invasion by the United States into the Chinese mainland. Xi has failed to take Taiwan. And in attacking the United States directly, he's only discovered that America's NATO allies take Article 5 very seriously. The same goes for other allies, including Japan and South Korea, which have aided the US both because of their military alliances with the country and because neither wants to see the spread of Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. Xi knows he's miscalculated. Now he faces a very big question. Does he launch nuclear weapons? China has around 500 nukes, as well as ICBMs, capable of reaching the continental United States. His country's CSS-4 Mod 2 Mod 3 missiles could do the job thanks to their 8,000-mile range. The DF-41 can also hit the mark, as it's capable of traveling nearly 7,500 miles. But Xi thinks better of it. Launching his nuclear weapons against the United States would mean a response in kind. And while America's Minuteman III ICBMs lack the range of his missiles, the country's submarines and aerial bombers could easily drop nukes all over China if provoked. Ultimately, China is forced to capitulate, though its military would prove a strong match for the United States alone and could even have the potential to defeat its American counterpart. It simply can't stand up to such a powerful united front. Taiwan proved stronger than Xi expected, with his failed invasion meaning plans to reach the American mainland never got off the ground. And with most of Europe, thanks to NATO, gunning for him, he can't escape the fact that he's been overwhelmed. Add to all of this the effects of the sanctions and trade blockades America created within days of him starting his war. They've slowly sapped the morale of the Chinese people, resulting in them being ready for surrender. America wins the war, but it's a win that came at a cost. It will take the US years to rebuild its war-torn navy, and along with its NATO allies, it will be heavily involved in imposing military restrictions on China for years to come. However, it's proven the impact that its cooperative approach to defense can have in a battle against one of its greatest rivals, putting any other major military power that might dare to attack the US on notice in the process. Of course, this is just one of many potential scenarios that could play out if China and the US went to war. It's also optimistic in favor of the US. But what could China do to prevent this series of events from happening? Would they happen at all, or do you think the US may struggle to receive the support it needs from NATO and its allies in Asia? Tell us what you think in the comments below. Now go and check out the US Navy's plan to defeat China in war, or click this other video instead. A superpower can be defined as a state with the ability to project power or exert influence on a global scale, usually in more than one region at a time. The United States has been the world's sole superpower since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, holding an unrivaled degree of economic and military dominance around the globe. Even today, with the rise of China, the US still remains by far the most powerful country, still far outstripping competitors in national power. It still has 3 times China's wealth and 5 times its military capabilities. And that's not to mention its enormous advantages in geography, demographics, and more. All things considered, it doesn't seem likely that the US is losing its status as global hegemon anytime soon. But hypothetically, what would happen if America found itself in a conflict against the entire rest of the world? Would the country still have the power to achieve victory, or would it be worn down and defeated? Today, we'll take a closer look at these questions, with a USA versus the world wargame. First, it goes without saying that such a scenario is extremely unlikely, if not downright impossible, during our lifetimes. Because of its diplomatic and economic ties around the world, as well as its huge arsenal of nuclear weapons, the US has almost entirely removed the possibility of real war with Europe and many other countries. But playing out the remote possibility still shows us a lot about US power and how it might look in the coming years. For the purpose of this video, we'll exclude nuclear weapons and assume that such a conflict would break out after a period of heightened global tensions rather than as a surprise attack. So who would really matter? The biggest challenges to the US in terms of actual military capability would certainly be China. Western European nations would be a close second, as they are wealthy and have stockpiles of advanced weapons and technology. While Russia, once considered to be America's main military challenger, its invasion of Ukraine has made clear that the country is something of a paper tiger, especially if its nuclear stockpile is out of the equation. India is another potential player, with the world's largest population and substantial military hardware. Together, China, Russia, India, and Europe account for the majority of the world's military spending outside of the US. In our hypothetical, let's say these countries all align against the US, with the rest of the world primarily contributing materiel or financial support. While this is extremely simplified, the fact of the matter is that most countries do not have the resources to project power beyond their borders or immediate region, making an attack on the US impossible. So let's say war breaks out. The first major difficulty with a global offensive against the US would be geographic. Surrounded by water on 2 sides, and Mexico and Canada to the north and south, any physical attack against the US would face major challenges. First, it would mean mounting either an enormous amphibious assault from one of the coasts or attempting to invade via land. But the deserts in the southwest and the Great Lakes in the Midwest insulate the country's major population centers from a potential invasion staged from Canada and Mexico. An invasion from outside North America would require massive fronts and long supply chains across the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans, leading to a dramatic reduction of overall power projection. Military expert Dylan Lurk has noted that even the largest amphibious assault in history on either the west coast or the east coast would be too insignificant to acquire an effective beachhead. If every foreign power managed to coordinate such a massive operation and do so while remaining undetected, under the enormous reach and power of the American intelligence apparatus, it would still have issues building up a force of any significant size before being pushed back into the sea. In addition, the strategic Hawaiian island chain acts as a gateway to the US mainland for attacks from the Pacific and is protected by a significant military presence. Similarly, military installations in Alaska provide protection against any invasion from along the Arctic or Northwest. An attack from Mexico would probably be more feasible due to the Great Lakes blocking much of the Canadian border. But California and Texas have the largest concentration of defense industries and military bases in the country, thus providing an effective deterrent from any attack, with the southwestern desert spanning the two regions. The Southwest is also home to multiple heavily armed military bases, such as the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico or NORAD headquarters in Colorado. An attack launched from Canada on the Midwest or the West would be limited to light infantry and would likely fail to take over population centers or other important strategic points, since there is mostly rural farmland and unpopulated national parks along the border, along with air bases located hundreds of miles south. Dr. Beckley makes this point as well, stating that the United States is a natural economic hub and military fortress. It's packed with resources and has more economic arteries like navigable waterways and ports than the rest of the world combined. And even if the US military was unable to stop an invasion, the huge diversity of terrain would also provide US military personnel or militias with the ability to conduct guerrilla warfare. The US is also by far the most heavily armed civilian population in the world, with a staggering 120 guns for every 100 people. This means that even if a coalition of other countries was able to actually get troops into the US, it would end up facing an incredibly well-armed and pissed-off insurgency. On the other hand, over the past 80 years, the US has developed a worldwide infrastructure of military bases, supply lines, and the world's largest air and naval transport fleets. This contains hundreds of ships and aircraft, more than the entire fleet of most countries. The lack of global mobility would be an enormous issue for any coalition facing the US. In the weeks before the sort of global conflict in our hypothetical, the US would most likely pull its forces out of the most vulnerable, non-American bases in Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, concentrating its resources in places where the US exercises greater territorial control to act as staging areas. Some areas would be considered too important to abandon, especially those supporting the military's supply chain, US oil assets, and key territorial choke points. One of the first battlefields in any conflict between the US and the rest of the world would be the Middle East. Here, one major aim of the DoD, as carried out by US Central Command, would be to secure critical US oil refineries and distribution centers, as well as gain control of the sea lanes used for transporting oil out of the region. As of 2022, 80.4% of the world's oil reserves are located in countries belonging to the international oil cartel OPEC, and 67.1% of OPEC reserves are in the Middle East. Similarly, over 60% of the world's oil passes through shipping lanes in the Arabian Sea alone. While the US has reduced its presence in the region in recent years, a global conflict would almost certainly cause a reorientation. Possessing the world's 12th largest oil reserves means that the US could theoretically go self-sufficient in wartime, but control of some Middle Eastern reserves would make guaranteeing its supply much easier. Similarly, it would allow the US to deny oil to much of the rest of the world and undermine the coalition's economies and military production. Europe, which would represent the US's most significant adversary, receives a significant amount of its crude oil and natural gas from the Middle East. This means that US military control of the region would harm Europe's ability to sustain a war effort for any extended period of time. China would face a similar issue, as over half of all its oil comes from the Middle East, making the region among one of the most likely fronts in a global war with the US. At the start of the conflict, the US would first strike at oil-related facilities across the Middle East, using carrier-based strike aircraft plus medium and long-range ballistic missiles. US power projection means that even without bases in Afghanistan, the military could easily hit targets anywhere from the Mediterranean to the Strait of Hormuz. While regional powers could offer some resistance, none of them have anywhere close to the manpower or firepower needed to stop the US in an all-out war. While Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and several others do have modern fighter jets and other weaponry, even they would not last very long up against the might of the DoD. And because each is an independent country, intelligence and resource sharing among them would also be limited, further reducing the region's ability to stand up to the US in a shooting war. Most of their assets' signals would also likely be jammed by America's powerful electronic warfare capabilities, which would disrupt enemy communications, targeting, and guidance systems across the region. The greatest threat to US control of the Middle East in our scenario comes from ground-based air defenses, as even older systems can shoot unsuspecting fighter jets from the sky. However, unlike Russia's recent experience in Ukraine, the US has actually proven that it can effectively destroy another nation's air defense network, as it did during Desert Storm in the 1990s. Today this might be even easier due to the enormous arsenal of drones the US has access to. Most US losses in the air would likely come from such drones, as well as fourth-generation jets like the F-15, while its more modern F-18s and F-22s could evade all but the best air defense systems. After establishing air superiority, the US would then work to control all choke points into and out of the region, especially the easily blocked Suez Canal, where over 12% of global trade passes through. If it was able to effectively keep regional control over the Middle East and its resources, the US would have a decent shot at winning against the rest of the world. A second major battlefield would be the Pacific, where the US would probably use its fleet to keep China and other East Asian nations contained and stop them from attacking the West Coast. This could mean either a blockade of major trade and supply routes, as well as using islands like Hawaii and Guam to stage its own offensives. It would also utilize its fleet of aircraft carriers heavily in the Asia-Pacific region. As of this video, there are 47 aircraft carriers around the world. The largest 11 of these are all nuclear-powered carriers belonging to the US, which have more than twice the combined total deck space of every other country combined. The Pacific Fleet fields 7 of these, and in a global war could use them to deny access to anything approaching the US mainland. Again, oil would be another top concern, and the US could use its massive navy to gain control of the Strait of Malacca, which carries up to 40% of the world's trade every year. While less easily choked off than the Suez Canal, a US blockade of this waterway would also devastate most economies in Asia, giving the US serious economic leverage over China, India, and others. The US would also likely exert its naval power in the South China Sea, which it could use to launch strikes against China, Japan, the Philippines, or any other regional power. Heavy fighting would ensue across the sea and air domains all around the South China Sea, and could account for the heaviest US casualties in any theater of this hypothetical war. Another potential target is Taiwan, where over 90% of the world's advanced microchips are currently fabricated. The US might even need to seize and try to occupy the island to stop the global coalition from dominating the production of modern electronics. To do so, the US would inevitably have to challenge China as well. Chinese air defenses and ballistic missile capabilities are already powerful alone, and if combined with the assets of every other country in the region, could potentially pose a problem for the US. The naval base on Guam would be especially vulnerable to strikes by ballistic missiles, which could overwhelm its limited air defenses. Even so, the US Navy is so powerful that every country in the East Pacific combined would be occupied with fending it off, and probably could not launch their own strikes on the US mainland. And because the US Navy is larger than those of the next 8 countries combined, it could easily fight in 2 or 3 theaters at once, making simultaneous blockades of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia-Pacific a real possibility. Another aspect of a global war would involve submarines, which unsurprisingly the US has more of than almost anyone else. Its fleet contains 53 fast-attack submarines, 14 nuclear-capable ballistic missile subs, and 4 guided missile subs. Even without using the world-ending nuclear capabilities of an Ohio-class submarine, this massive fleet would allow the US to launch stealth attacks on enemy naval vessels anywhere in the world, completely undetected. While America would be far more hard-pressed to fend off a global coalition on the ground, at sea the US stands a much better chance of victory. A third global area of battle would be the Americas, where the US would have the greatest ability to marshal forces and project power. And because Mexico, Canada, and other countries in the region are far less powerful, there is a good chance the US could blockade, control, or destroy the majority of their military and economic resources. Canada and Venezuela are both obvious targets because of their status as oil producers. and in a global war, the US would probably aim to shut down or take control of resources in both. Another obvious target is the Panama Canal, which serves as the gateway between the Atlantic and Pacific, and where 40% of all US container shipping flows through. The US controlled the canal from 1903 to 1979, and would try to seize it again during a global war. This would also provide a choke point against the militaries of Central and South America. Chile is another potential target as the country supplies 28% of the world's copper, critical for the production of modern electronics. Now, obviously, a hypothetical alliance of every other country in the world would have the numerical advantage in overall troops and economic resources. But keep in mind that as of 2022, US military spending was $877 billion, constituting 40% of the global total and more than the next 10 countries combined. Today, this enormous sum still only accounts for about 3% of the country's GDP. In a global war, this percentage would almost certainly increase and could rise to similar levels as World War II, when US military spending accounted for over 40% of national GDP. Today, that would mean somewhere close to $10 trillion a year in military spending from the US alone, nearly 5 times the global total from 2022. Astronomical numbers like these mean that a war of attrition against America would also be likely to fail, as the country could outspend the rest of the world several times over for many years. To gain a true strategic edge over the US, a global coalition would have to somehow outgun and outspend the Defense Department, while also maintaining their own smaller economies. Another crucial domain in a global conflict with the US would play out in cyberspace. This would probably be the first line of contact between the warring parties, as both sides would attempt to gain information superiority and take each other's systems offline. While US Cyber Command would almost certainly be overwhelmed with attacks by many actors at once, America could also use its own highly effective attacks to shut down enemy power grids, computer networks, weapons, electronics, and much more. And while it's not as dominant in cyberspace as in the real world, the US still has by far the most capable and best-funded capabilities in the world. In the 2024 fiscal year, US cyber spending will rise to more than $25 billion, and the country continues to top every ranking of national cyber power. However, this domain would also be one of the biggest dangers to the US in a global war, as cyber attacks are notoriously difficult to predict and defend against. A well-placed cyber attack by a less powerful nation could still be catastrophic, and would probably be a more serious immediate threat to US citizens than a kinetic strike on the country. However, again, we have no way of knowing how much American cyber spending would increase in a total war, or how quickly that would lead to new capabilities. All the elements point to a big conclusion. The US is so powerful that it could take on the rest of the world for weeks or months with no certain winner. Because of this, such a hypothetical conflict would likely become a war of attrition in both the physical and digital worlds. The US would work to starve the world's other major powers of oil, war supplies, and other vital resources, while attempting to preserve its own. A true assault on the US mainland would be extremely difficult because of the country's size, geographic positioning, and incredibly well-armed military and civilian population. Because of the US military's global presence, most of the fighting would likely happen elsewhere, opening theaters of war everywhere from the Middle East to South America and East Asia. In the end, the victor would almost certainly be whichever side could outlast the other, both in terms of military and economic resources. While the scenario of America versus the entire world is obviously an absurd one, it does give us a useful picture of just how powerful the US military really is. With resources greater than those of most individual countries and nearly limitless power projection, even a conventional conflict against the US would be very hard to achieve true victory. Add in the country's continued dominance in cyberspace, and it's not all clear whether the rest of the world would actually be able to win such a war. And all of the speculation above excludes the most powerful part of the equation: nuclear weapons. Because of the principle of mutually assured destruction, no country really wants to use them today. However, it's worth noting that the US has over 1,400 actively deployed nukes, and in any real global conflict, they could be used to give any non-nuclear country a very permanent end. And even in a very distant hypothetical like the one above, we should remember that the cost of human life in any worldwide conflict would be staggering, and that even winners in such a war would suffer. But what do you think? Would the US really be able to win a war against the rest of the world, or would the country eventually be overwhelmed? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. The current era of global politics has often been described as a return to the days of great power competition. But while this is usually taken to mean competition between the United States and other rising powers, it's worth remembering that a major war could just as easily break out between two countries much closer together, China and Russia. While leaders of the two countries have stressed their close friendship for years, the truth is a bit more complicated. While they both have autocratic governments opposed to the Western-led international order, in reality, there are many points of contention in the China-Russia relationship, any number of which could potentially lead to a conflict. But what would a war between these two vast countries actually look like? Who would have the upper hand? And what would it mean for the rest of the world? To answer these questions, we first need to take a look back at the way Chinese-Russian relations developed. Their shared modern history began in the earliest days of the Cold War, with the 1949 victory of the Chinese Communist Party in the Chinese Civil War. The Soviet Union quickly moved to become a patron of the new country, seeing it as a critical junior partner in the broader Cold War. This was formalized in 1950, as Mao and Stalin signed the so-called Treaty of Friendship, Alliance and Mutual Assistance. This treaty strengthened the two countries' geopolitical relationship on political, military and economic levels, including a loan from the USSR of over $300 million. However, the two countries' relationship began to deteriorate soon afterwards, leading to the Sino-Soviet split in the late 1950s. This followed several years where China worked with a large number of Soviet advisors who encouraged the Chinese leaders to follow the Russian model of development with an emphasis on heavy industry funded by taxes and levies from the peasantry, whilst making consumer goods a low priority. When Stalin died in 1953, Mao felt he was now the senior leader and was resentful when the new Soviet leaders Malenkov and Khrushchev did not recognize him as such. Mao had ignored many of Stalin's requests, but he had respected him as a world leader and symbol of communism. But in 1956, Khrushchev denounced Stalin during his secret speech, and although Mao didn't react publicly to the news, he was privately infuriated. Tensions continued to build through 1959, when Khrushchev held a summit meeting with US President Dwight Eisenhower. The Soviets were alarmed by developments within China and sought to appease the West. They also refused to honor their earlier commitment to help China develop nuclear weapons and support Mao in his border dispute with China. Mao was offended by these actions. He felt Khrushchev was being far too accommodating to Western demands. However, the Soviet leadership were well aware that the Americans could match or exceed their nuclear capabilities, and they sought to engage the US in strategic dialogue and negotiations aimed at avoiding the outbreak of war. For much the same reason, the Soviet leadership became determined not to give Mao nuclear weapons. By June 1960, the split between Russia and China became public when Khrushchev and Peng Zhen openly clashed. During 1962, international events caused the final split between the Soviet Union and China. Mao criticized Khrushchev for backing down in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Khrushchev responded by declaring that Mao's policies would lead to nuclear war. By 1965, the Sino-Soviet split was an established fact, and the start of Mao's Cultural Revolution severed all contact between not only the two countries, but between China and most of the rest of the world. As late as 1970, Mao realized that he could not simultaneously confront the Soviet Union, United States, and suppress internal disorder. Mao decided that because of their geographical proximity, the Soviets were a greater threat, and so he decided to open a dialogue with America and so confront the USSR. In July 1971, Henry Kissinger made a secret visit to Beijing to make the arrangements for a visit by President Nixon in the following year. The Soviets retaliated by organizing their own summit with Nixon. This paved the way to creating a triangular relationship between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow, ending the worst period of confrontation between the USSR and China. Today, more than 30 years after the end of the Cold War, Russia and China maintain a complex relationship with a different set of tensions. But despite the declarations of friendship from both sides, the outbreak of war between them is always a possibility. And unlike the days of the Sino-Soviet split, Moscow wouldn't have the upper hand. China's enormous economic and military growth in the past 3 decades and Russia's loss of most of its Soviet territory and human capital has drastically shifted the balance of power between the two. Today, China's economy is more than 3.5 times the size of Russia's, while its military is both more modern and better funded. Another major point of contention is far east of Russia, which many of the country's politicians believe has become part of China's sphere of influence. Declining Russian population and a failure to build infrastructure in the region since the end of the USSR has increased this trend further, especially as they have been replaced with Chinese immigrants and foreign investment. Similarly, Chinese interest in the region's extensive energy resources has dramatically increased in recent years, as the superpower's economic growth has begun to slow. A final point of contention between China and Russia has to do with the sale and manufacture of weapons. For decades, China was among the most reliable buyers of Soviet weaponry, but today, the country has developed its own extensive defense industry, in no small part due to espionage by Chinese agents, who have stolen plans for classified Russian technology for years. In some instances, being caught red-handed. China has also violated many of its licensing agreements with Russia around fighter aircraft and other technology, building its own without continuing to buy engines and electronic systems from Russia. Given these trends, there are several major flashpoints between the two nations which could theoretically turn very ugly very fast. When it comes to a military showdown between the two powers, the scales have also tilted more and more firmly in favor of China. While Russian nuclear weapons and overall equipment stockpiles have long kept it as one of the foremost military powers, in recent years, estimates of the country's basic competency, availability of equipment, tactical effectiveness, and leadership have all come under serious question. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shown that its armed forces are barely capable, and that they are far more suited for conflicts against weak forces like Syrian rebel groups. Up against even a small amount of NATO weaponry and support, Russian forces have fared disastrously. And while China's hardware is still nowhere near as advanced as that of NATO, there is good reason to believe that it would now outstrip Russia in any sort of direct military engagement. But Russia's recent failures have also cast doubt on the effectiveness of Chinese forces, especially since they have not fought an active war this century. And even back in 1979, China was militarily defeated by Vietnam, a far smaller country already exhausted from decades of war. While China claimed victory in the conflict, it failed to achieve its primary objective of preventing Vietnam from overthrowing the genocidal Chinese-backed Khmer Rouge government in neighboring Cambodia. While China's capabilities have grown enormously since then, and its military doctrine has been updated and modeled off of that of the US, the current forces are largely untested in battle. In one major way, this gives China a different problem from Russia, which has a military with substantial combat experience, but hopelessly outdated doctrine and equipment. And in a head-to-head contest between the two countries, China seems to have a definite advantage. But some experts have speculated that below the surface, its defense sector may have just as many issues. For instance, corruption in China may run just as deeply as in Russia, a problem which only came to light during President Xi Jinping's corruption purges in the late 2010s. Yet such purges were also more of a political tool than anything else, and likely did little to fix the root of the problem. So in a theoretical Chinese-Russian war, both sides would likely suffer from corruption and poor resource management. Similarly, the defenses on both sides, particularly Russia, would quickly become an issue. Russian air defenses have long been vaunted as among the most advanced in the world, but the war in Ukraine again cast doubt on this claim. Using drones, Ukraine has been able to penetrate Russian air defenses on numerous occasions, striking deep inside the country at military bases, command and control centers, and even cities. China has far more drones than Ukraine, suggesting that it could overwhelm Russian air defenses with relative ease. However, the reverse is also possible, as Russia still maintains a large stockpile of missiles capable of reaching Chinese cities, as well as numerous Iranian-manufactured drones. However, missiles and drones aside, it's clear that in a conflict, China would have a definite advantage in terms of funding, personnel, and overall capability. So how might such a war actually play out? On the ground, there would likely be skirmishes along most of the Russian-Chinese border, while sparsely populated Mongolia, which sits sandwiched between the two powers, would likely become a major avenue of attack. In the event of a Chinese invasion, Mongolia would provide a perfect staging ground to attack and seize land in the vulnerable Russian east. While Russia has historically kept substantial forces in the area to deter such an attack, the war in Ukraine has forced Putin to pull nearly all his available troops to the European border, leaving the south and east quite exposed to any attacks. China, on the other hand, has been able to maintain its forces along the Russian and Mongolian borders, giving it a distinct advantage on the ground. That's not to mention that the Chinese armed forces are far more numerous than Russia's, with almost double the active duty forces. And while numbers aren't everything, it seems likely that a Chinese ground attack on the south and east of Russia would be able to capture and hold large swathes of territory. However, one area where Russia would still have something of an advantage is in the air. The Russian Air Force, or VKS, has long been viewed as one of the world's most formidable, with a large fleet of reliable planes and even a number of next-gen fighter jets such as the Sukhoi Su-57, which utilizes stealth technology and advanced avionics. While China's fleet of fighter jets is more numerous, with over 1,200 aircraft to Russia's 750, there is little doubt that Russia would have a qualitative edge in the skies. Even so, the war in Ukraine has once again cast doubt on supposedly superior Russian capabilities, as the country has failed to establish air superiority at any stage of its invasion. As the UK Ministry of Defence recently noted, this reality has made it extremely difficult for Russian forces to take any new territory, as the lack of air support has led to repeated failures to break a Ukrainian bridgehead across the Dnipro River. In a conflict with a country as large and powerful as China, Russia would almost certainly be even more hard-pressed to field effective air support. This is especially true today, as Western sanctions from the invasion of Ukraine have made it impossible for Russia to obtain the components needed to produce more advanced fighters. China, while not on the best terms with Western states, does not suffer from the same level of crippling sanctions on its aerospace or broader defense industries. On the Chinese side, one major challenge in an offensive against Russia would be its comparative lack of tanker aircraft, limiting the ability of its air force to refuel near the front lines. Another area where Russia would historically have had a major advantage is in ground-based air defenses. Under Vladimir Putin's decades-long rule, Russia has continually upgraded its air defense systems, many of which are designed to fight off the far more powerful US Air Force. Until 2022, it was widely presumed that Russian air defenses, especially newer systems like the S-400 and S-500, could handle almost anything thrown at them. But on numerous occasions, they failed miserably against Ukrainian drone and missile attacks, in what the US-based Institute for the Study of War has called a systematic tactical failure, which suggests that Russian forces were unprepared to intercept missiles with the system or were unable to do so. Similarly, scholars from US Air University recently wrote that Russia continued to suffer from a strategic priority on defensive over offensive operations, failure to develop sufficient capacity and capability for operations at this scale, and comparatively immature operational concepts. As a result, Russian air defenses have failed to stop numerous Ukrainian strikes deep inside the country. In a potential conflict with China, this failure would likely be compounded, and there is good reason to believe that China could overwhelm Russian air defenses in most parts of the country. On the other hand, China's air defense systems are largely untested, so there is significant debate about their capabilities. However, as the RAND Corporation pointed out several years ago, Chinese systems are now advanced enough that they would pose a serious challenge even to the US. As they note, in 1996, the vast majority of China's 500-plus long-range surface-to-air missile systems were Chinese duplicates of the obsolete Russian SA-2 missile. By 2010, China had deployed roughly 200 launchers for double-digit SAMs. The newer missiles have more sophisticated seekers and ranges of up to 200 kilometers. Combined with more capable fighter aircraft and the addition of a new airborne warning and control system, the Chinese Integrated Air Defense System (IADS) has become a formidable obstacle. Given assessments like this, it's very possible that Chinese air defense systems now outstrip those of Russia. And in any military contest between the two powers, victory would likely come down to both control of the skies and resources to maintain that control. On a broader level, the development and maintenance of military technology would also be a major factor in a war between China and Russia. While both countries are at a general level of technological parity, they do differ significantly in their industrial bases and ability to produce more. China's economy is far larger, at $26.8 trillion, to Russia's $4 trillion, a factor that would give it a substantial advantage in any drawn-out military engagement. Due to many of these factors, Russia's main chance of victory in such a war would be to utilize the element of surprise, as well as its asymmetric capabilities, such as the Wagner Group and other PMC groups with combat experience. But if Russia failed to secure large early gains, it's very likely that the balance of power would shift towards China, given its superior resources, manpower, and global connections. But in the end, the reality is that a fight between China and Russia would have no real winner. It would almost certainly be dragged down into a brutal and widespread war of attrition, with enormous destruction and potentially millions of civilian casualties. While China would certainly have the upper hand, we should always remember that any such contest would undoubtedly be a disaster for much of our modern world. But what do you think? Would Russia be able to hold off a Chinese attack, or would China's military and economic might overwhelm a sanctioned and faltering Russian military? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. Will Putin launch an attack on the USA? The possibility of a Russian attack on the US has been a top national security concern for decades. Since the earliest days of the Cold War, US policymakers have run war games and maintained preparations for a range of possible attacks. Now, with the war in Ukraine raging and US-Russia relations at their worst point in decades, it is a question which has returned to the minds of many. While such an event is still extremely unlikely to occur, it raises several hypothetical questions. What could a limited or not so limited Russian attack on US assets look like? What's our best guess at how things might play out? And what chance, if any, would Russia stand in a real war against the American military and NATO? One thing's for sure, Putin is not happy about the West repeatedly coming to Ukraine's aid in the Russo-Ukrainian war, and with Russia's army failing miserably on the battlefield, it may only be a matter of time before Putin's threats to either back off and stop helping Ukraine or face a showdown start coming in. Here's how it could go down. It's late 2023. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has been raging for over a year and a half, with both sides taking enormous amounts of casualties. But armed with more and more Western firepower and training, the Ukrainian military has pushed Russian troops out of most of eastern Ukraine. Russia's mass conscription and brutal human wave tactics have not been enough, and it has lost nearly all of its conquered territory outside of Crimea. Increasingly desperate and fearing that oligarchs or commanders will soon topple him from power, Vladimir Putin decides to pull out all the stops. He threatens to do anything necessary to stop the West from further arming Ukraine and to regain Russia's historical sphere of influence, but most assume he is still bluffing. However, indications from US intelligence hint that this time it might be something more serious. Putin puts out a televised statement claiming that the US and NATO have 72 hours to begin removing their on-the-ground trainers and Patriot missile systems to halt the flow of Western weapons into the country, and if they do not, Russia reserves the right to defend itself. President Joe Biden responds, saying that the West will not back down or be intimidated by Putin. For a brief moment, everyone falls silent, but the peace doesn't last long before the storm hits. Several days pass, with continued heavy fighting in Ukraine, but no more threats. Then, suddenly, an innocent software update from the week before crashes internal servers from the White House, Department of Defense, NATO High Command, and Ukrainian armed forces, as well as more than a dozen defense-associated companies using advanced malware. At the same time, a mass-distributed denial of service or DDoS attack overwhelms secondary computer systems, flooding them with traffic and crashing them. On the malware-infected computers, a message appears demanding that the US halt its support of Ukraine or face further consequences. What now? According to experts like retired General Herbert "Hawk" Carlisle, former head of the Air Combat Command, such escalation in cyberspace would likely follow a period of heightened tensions and warnings, and in an all-out conflict, the US and NATO would have to initially counter Russian cyber capabilities. Because of advance warning from intelligence agencies, the US would most likely have the time to prepare for a physical Russian attack by increasing its combat capacity in both Europe and Alaska. But it could get darker. A conflict opening with a hostile cyber attack could come with much less warning, and provide Russia with a small early advantage against vastly superior US and NATO capabilities. Alright, so Putin is officially gearing up for a fight. What comes next? As US, NATO, and Ukrainian authorities scramble to bring their essential computer systems back online, intelligence agencies begin to pick up increased activity at Russian missile launch sites on both Ukrainian and Polish borders, as well as at major military installations around Vladivostok and Kaliningrad at two ends of the country. In response to the cyber attack and troop movement, the Department of Defense moves the US to DEFCON 2. In this posture, only ever used during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, the US would have the Army, Navy, and Air Force poised for combat and ready to deploy in hours. US and NATO Cyber Command then quickly mount a retaliatory cyber operation, which could involve substantial disruption of Russian communications and activation of malware attacks on critical computer systems, power grids, and military bases. But let's say Putin takes it a step further. As both Western and Russian computer systems are still recovering that same day, the Russian Air Force begins flying sorties into NATO airspace over Poland. Then, suddenly, Russian missiles fired from the border of Ukraine strike 3 air bases in Poland and Romania involved in supplying military assistance to Ukraine. Despite air defenses, there are roughly a dozen US and NATO casualties and significant damage to the base's infrastructure. Some of the missiles miss their target and hit nearby areas, killing another dozen civilians. Putin releases a statement promising further such attacks on other targets if NATO and US assistance to Ukraine does not end. Within minutes, news of the attack reaches the US president, transmitted via a network of 6 jamming-resistant satellites which provide real-time communications to the US, Canadian, Dutch, Australian, and British militaries. Let's pause for a moment to hear what military experts have to say about the likelihood of this type of event sequence. In a December 2022 paper, the RAND Corporation, the DoD's think tank, outlines 3 possible scenarios for a Russian first strike on a US or NATO target: demonstrative, focused, or less restrained. This hypothetical is their Scenario C, a focused attack, the third most severe of their 4 Russian strike possibilities. At this point, DoD and NATO leadership would have to decide whether to continue escalation and retaliate with kinetic strikes of their own, or to back down and try to defuse the situation. Because of the severity of such an attack with casualties from multiple NATO members, US and NATO leaders would almost certainly decide the attack requires retaliation in kind to satisfy NATO members' concerns about the credibility of Article 5. In short, it's time to fight back. Advised to take early action, the president calls an emergency session of Congress, which within hours passes a joint resolution authorizing the limited use of military force against Russia and its allies. The president gives a televised speech stating that the US has taken its own retaliatory actions for the unprovoked attack, but that the US response is purely defensive. US ground forces will not enter Russia, he declares, in hopes of stopping escalation to the level of full war. The US therefore decides to launch a proportional response on Russian targets in Ukraine. Even before the speech is finished, 2 US-controlled Reaper drones take off from air bases in Poland. Once over Ukrainian airspace, they strike Russian air bases and missile defenses in Crimea, killing several dozen soldiers and destroying a number of planes. At the same time, the US launches a number of modified SM-3 missiles from its ships around the world, knocking out a handful of Russian communication satellites. This strike leaves Russia with limited GPS targeting and communications capabilities. So far, so good. But while Biden and other Western leaders urge Putin to back down and not escalate things anymore, they receive no answer. Putin decides he cannot back down now. The next day, 2 MiG-31 fighter jets enter Polish airspace. Before they can be destroyed, they fire Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, managing to hit 2 NATO missile batteries and killing another half-dozen soldiers. At the same time, all gas from the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is shut off, leaving millions of homes in Europe with no gas supply. By this point, escalation in Europe is nearly inevitable. NATO calls an emergency summit, and after 2 days of initial resistance from Turkey and several other states, Article 5 is officially invoked. But top NATO officials stress that their operations against Russia will be limited and purely defensive. Defensive, but powerful. With Article 5 invoked, the first priority of NATO troops is to take out Russian air defenses near Europe, before striking air bases and missile launch sites to try and stop shelling of NATO assets. So after multiple missile salvos from US submarines and aircraft carriers in the Black Sea and Mediterranean wipe out most of Russia's western surface-to-air defenses, Fighter jets and long-range bombers from NATO countries begin to engage in aerial dogfights with Russian planes across Eastern Europe. The older Russian jets are quickly outmatched and outnumbered, but combined with the remaining air defenses, they are still able to take out a handful of F-15s and other NATO assets. Fighting is especially concentrated around western Poland and Kaliningrad, which NATO strikes repeatedly and declares a no-fly zone over. The massive US fleet of 650 tanker jets also takes off from North America and begins to circle the Atlantic, providing in-air refueling for more F-15s and F-16s called in from air bases in the US. American cargo planes also embark across the ocean, carrying troops, heavy vehicles, and supplies, which will be used to resupply the growing front in Eastern Europe. And this is just the beginning. At the same time, all US troops in Europe are recalled from leave to be mobilized. The US Army's 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team in Italy and its 2nd Cavalry Regiment in Germany join NATO forces from across Europe and engage Russian troops on the borders of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Poland. While Russia's failures in Ukraine make the prospect of them taking another national capital doubtful at best, Russian missiles and artillery begin striking towns near the border, causing immense damage to the area's infrastructure and killing dozens more civilians. More cyber attacks are also unleashed against the power grids in Estonia, Poland, and Lithuania, causing rolling blackouts. US air defenses in Poland are able to down some of the incoming missiles, but many which were fired indiscriminately still get through. Putin also orders a full-scale draft and mobilization of all young men in Russia, seeking to get cannon fodder to the front as quickly as possible. Great! More fresh-faced Russian conscripts heading to the front lines. Has Putin learned nothing from his past mistakes? Regardless, let's take a look at what's happening in Europe while all this is going on. As you can imagine, things get pretty bad. While many national leaders urge people to remain calm, commercial air and rail traffic in Eastern Europe grinds to a halt, and the stock market begins to crash, creating panic. Nord Stream gas remains cut off, and refugees fleeing the crisis also continue to move west, stoking fears of a mass humanitarian crisis across Europe. The UN continues to press for a ceasefire, but Putin says he will not back down until his demands are met, though he stops short of explicitly threatening nuclear action. Western leaders respond that he must immediately cease all military activity, withdraw, and stand down all Russian troops. They announce a range of crippling new sanctions against Russian businesses, individuals, and weapon suppliers. This alone may not stop Putin's aggression. Every bit of pressure that can be added to weaken Russia's strength and security could contribute to its eventual defeat. The following day, combined NATO and US forces, including armored brigades from Poland, head north to fully cut off Russia from Kaliningrad and encircle the exclave, with the US 6th and 7th fleets moving into striking positions in the Black Sea and Pacific. While Russia could likely muster some ground troops outside of Ukraine, they would be unlikely to launch a full invasion of any Baltic country in a conflict with the US or NATO, especially since the Baltic troops are far from Russia's best. As noted by Mike Kaufman, Russia analyst at the Center for Naval Analysis, Russia's military modernization and force structure expansion had been ignoring the Baltic region until only recently. Despite provocative air and naval activity concentrated in the area, Russian forces based there are principally defensive and aging to boot. While many analysts still argued prior to the invasion of Ukraine that Russia could surround Baltic capitals in as little as 36 hours, those estimates have since come under serious doubt. In a serious confrontation with multiple NATO member states, Russia would likely take significant early losses and be forced to rely mostly on irregular warfare, missile strikes, and artillery. So back and forth missile strikes and aerial dogfights rage, along with artillery barrages and ground combat on Russia's borders with the Baltic states, while the United Nations continues to call for a ceasefire. Things are about to escalate. At this point, nearly a week into the growing conflict, Russia's resources are already strained to the point of total depletion. But Putin desperately needs something to make a statement and try to force the West to give him concessions. What will he do? Assuming that he does not opt for the nuclear option, fingers crossed, right? One possibility is to use Russia's vast geography to its advantage. So in an attempt to stretch out US resources, Russian fighter jets attempt to launch preemptive strikes against several US military installations in Alaska. These attacks are primarily aimed at disrupting communications and destroying military assets before they can be mobilized to attack Russia from the Pacific. While US missile defenses stop nearly all the strikes, several damage US communications arrays. Russia also launches another round of DDoS cyber attacks against US computer networks in order to further disrupt communications and try to sow confusion among American forces. In addition to this, submarines from Russia's Pacific Fleet begin to move, putting more of their long-range missiles within striking range of US bases in the Pacific. The US Navy responds by moving the 3rd Fleet to strategic locations up and down the west coast, and the 7th Fleet into a blockade off Russia's eastern coast, as part of an effort to counter Russia's naval presence in the Pacific. The US Air Force launches bombers from bases in Japan, Guam, Hawaii, and Alaska towards key targets across eastern Russia, striking military facilities at Vladivostok, Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, Kamchatsky, Magadan, and elsewhere, while engaging enemy fighters over Alaska and northern Russia as part of a defensive operation against further strikes into American airspace. Because Russia has diverted many of its Pacific air defenses to the border with Ukraine, many US missiles find their targets, destroying numerous Russian air bases and communication centers. US Cyber Command also launches another round of cyber attacks against both Russian computer systems and missile silos, disabling more of them before they can be launched. Meanwhile, allied US and NATO ground troops dig into defensive positions on their respective borders with Ukraine and Belarus, as tensions over nuclear weapons continues to mount. In response, Russian troops and allied militias gather in Belarus, preparing to try and retake the Kaliningrad corridor, but by this point, much of Russia's communication infrastructure and military hardware is damaged or gone, and its forces stretched thin, forcing Putin to rely more heavily on asymmetric warfare or shock value. Desperate times call for desperate measures, sure, but do they work? The following day, Russian allied militia groups begin to launch guerrilla-style raids across the borders from Belarus, Kaliningrad, and Transnistria, attacking both civilian and military targets. Running out of both ammunition and artillery, they use improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, and other makeshift weapons to terrorize villages and towns. NATO forces respond with more heavy artillery and shelling and precision missile strikes for the next 2 days, aiming to cut off the flow of insurgents across the borders. Since Russia's military assets are now significantly depleted, its proxy forces fail to retake either the Kaliningrad corridor or more territory in Ukraine. Despite the growing NATO casualties due to IEDs and other attacks, the insurgents are decimated by the relentless artillery strikes. In Ukraine, troops take advantage of Russia's depleted resources to launch a lightning offensive into Crimea, shelling Sevastopol and moving to cut off the peninsula from Russia. Meanwhile, in the east, Russia's Air Force and Pacific Fleet, as well as most of its communications arrays, have been crippled by the US, putting substantial pressure on Putin. In a last-ditch effort to overwhelm NATO and US resolve, Putin orders a third, massive barrage of cyber attacks. The attacks target the wider power grid and are able to cause mass blackouts in cities across Europe and America, leaving millions without power, even as refugees continue to flood into Western Europe. EU and US officials declare a state of emergency and ask for humanitarian assistance from the other UN member states. Rolling blackouts last 2 days, during which time heavy fighting continues near Russia and Belarus's borders, both against regular troops and militia groups targeting civilians. Despite the cyber attacks, Russian allied troops continue to take far heavier losses than those of NATO and the US, and are pushed back from the edge of the Baltic states deeper into Russian territory. Holding to their word, NATO troops do not pursue them, but set up a heavily fortified buffer zone on the border. Then, after weeks of heavy shelling and being blockaded from air, land, and sea, the remaining Russian troops at Kaliningrad surrender, and the exclave is taken by NATO ground troops. In the east, the US blockade continues, as do retaliatory strikes on Russian communications and missile areas. But the surrender at Kaliningrad and mass attack on the European power grid continue to spread fears that the war will become a nuclear conflict between NATO allies and Russia. National leaders from around the world urge an end to the fighting. Despite this, Putin gives a speech raging against NATO's imperialism and says Russia will not back down if Kaliningrad is not returned to Russian control and Western support for Ukraine does not cease. With a global recession and refugee crisis deepening, the situation looks grim. Are all roads leading towards a full-blown nuclear war? After nearly 2 weeks of intense fighting between NATO allies and Russian allied forces, NATO leaders announced plans for a full-scale invasion into Belarus if Moscow does not withdraw its support for separatists operating within Ukraine and NATO territory immediately. This announcement comes on top of growing speculation about whether or not nuclear war might erupt between Moscow and Washington after days of escalating combat between both sides, and the mass Russian disruption to European power grids. But despite his cyber attack, at this point Putin is out of options. Most of Russia's military capabilities have been destroyed, and there are critical shortages of ammunition, equipment, food, medicine, and other essentials. In under 2 weeks, Russia has lost tens of thousands more troops compared to the relatively light losses by NATO and the US. Its Pacific Fleet and Eastern military installations have been wiped out by the US, and in the West, it has lost control of both Kaliningrad and much of Crimea, putting the critical naval base of Sevastopol under Ukrainian control. The only major city in Ukraine still held by Russia is Mariupol, where its remaining occupation troops are dug in trying to avoid artillery and drone strikes. Most Russian forces have been forced to pull back miles from the border, where they continue to face shelling, and hospitals are completely overwhelmed. Supply lines are so destroyed that many unlucky soldiers have even begun to starve. As conditions worsen in the next few days, Putin's war effort begins its inevitable collapse. Substantial numbers of Russian troops begin to surrender or mutiny, refusing to follow orders and turning themselves over as prisoners. Finally, buckling under pressure and trying to save face, Putin announces that Russia has taught the West a lesson and is open to negotiations. An emergency session of the UN Security Council is convened several days later, where plans begin to be drawn up for a ceasefire, the return of Kaliningrad to Russian control, autonomy for areas of eastern Ukraine, and the creation of a demilitarized zone along the Russian border. Although this is just one hypothetical scenario for a US-NATO-Russia conflict, which is still very unlikely, it demonstrates some of the options available to both sides in open conventional warfare. An extremely outmatched Russia would likely have to rely on asymmetric strategies, but even that would likely do little to halt the combined efforts of the US military and NATO. With their combined firepower, logistical strength, and technology, there is almost no non-nuclear scenario where Russia could hold its own militarily. Even so, this example illustrates the devastating toll on human life that could result from even a short conventional war. But what do you think? What would happen if Russia attacked the US? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content. Going into war isn't always a choice. More often than not, it's a necessity. And even with NATO's support of Ukrainian independence, it seems like Putin is leaving the US less and less choice in the decision of whether or not to get more actively involved in the war in Ukraine. But if the US had to suddenly engage in a full-scale war against Russia, how would it fare? What plans is it making for such an eventuality? One thing is for sure, Putin had better buckle up. The US military keeps its M1 Abrams oiled up, its Tomahawks loaded, and its star-spangled heroes capes nearby all year round. It is always prepared and has kept a particularly close watch on the former Soviet Union ever since the 1940s. During the Cold War, the West had it easy. Despite communist coups and the proxy wars, the Americans and their NATO allies always knew exactly who the real threat was, the foe pulling the strings behind the scenes, if you will. It was, of course, the Soviet Union. For 45 years, the West had prepared, strategized, and planned for the ultimate eventuality, an all-out military confrontation with the Soviet superpower. Whether the Cold War conflict went hot by spiraling into the nuclear realm, or if kinetic operations remained firmly moored in the familiar bounds of conventional warfare, made little difference. What mattered most was that the enemy and its intentions were clear. Knowing that is half the battle. But what happened next changed everything. The Soviet collapse in the early 1990s kick-started 3 decades of self-discovery as the US spread its wings as the world's sole superpower. Combating terrorists, genocidal dictators, and non-state tyrants became the order of the day. NATO members drifted apart, the alliance's mission and purpose suddenly cast into doubt. Then came a 2-decade forever war in the Middle East. We all know how that turned out. After a decade of strategic revision, the US finally embarked on a wholesale pivot to Asia, now hoping to contain a Chinese threat which had for decades grown stronger almost in plain sight. And then February 2022 happened. Russia invaded Ukraine. Geopolitical clarity, it seemed, was restored. The aggressive Russian bear, whose foreign policy since the Soviet collapse had vacillated somewhere between bitter Western resentment and surprising Western rapprochement, showed its true colors. America, firmly committed to bolstering its presence in the Indo-Pacific, nevertheless seized the opportunity in Europe. For years it had been nursing its wounds, trying to restore European partnerships and alliances which had slowly atrophied under the pressure of populist politics. The invasion recast these relationships in stone. Everyone in the Western world suddenly saw the reflection of their own histories in Ukraine's existential fight for its independence. The US and its Western allies pledged collective action. Sanctions, hybrid warfare, material donations, refugee support, and military training. Everything short of entering the fight themselves. This Western support coalition has shown no signs of weakening now, more than a year into the war. If Finland's recent accession to NATO says anything, it has only grown stronger. What is this all leading to? For the Americans, who for a decade could not drum up the political unity required to deal with Russian revisionism, the Russian threat is credible once more. The pivot to Asia will continue apace. But now, with Eastern European sovereignty under threat once more, America must continue to do everything in its power to prepare it and its European allies for the ultimate eventuality, a full-scale war with Russia. We know you're probably laughing right about now. War with Russia, you're saying. The same Russia that can barely make inroads against a country 28 times smaller and with 100 million fewer people than itself. The same Russia that has allegedly already suffered 250,000 casualties in a single year of fighting, more than the entire number of Russian soldiers killed in every war the Soviet Union and Russia fought since World War II combined. Well, yeah, that Russia. As counterintuitive as it now seems, Russia still poses a grave threat to Eurasian security and Western values the world over. Western analysts are contemplating a number of contingencies that could result from the war in Ukraine, which fortunately for us all has thus far remained contained to a single country. The major one is the potentiality that Russia and its fuming dictator Vladimir Putin, finally recognizing the futility of winning a long-term victory in Ukraine, go absolutely rogue. Russia has all but burned its remaining capital with the West. Politically, Putin is a global pariah. Economically, Russia has been cut off from Western markets. Its once profitable natural gas left with virtually nowhere to go. Sanctions continue to cut into its ability to supply its military and civilian population with the specialized industrial and technological parts it needs to function effectively. Militarily, there's little evidence the latest round of mobilization will provide the tactical momentum Russia needs to win over the long term. Rather, it's more likely that untrained Russian conscripts or mobiks will continue to be fed into the meat grinder to little effect. Will Putin back down? You can almost guarantee he won't. He's already raised the stakes too high. His people, his propagandists at least, expect too much of him. He's paranoid. He must deliver on his promises. The Ukrainians, as long as they live and breathe, will never accept the Russian occupation on any scale. As a final recourse, Putin still has his nuclear umbrella, something he knows the West won't gamble on. From our vantage point today, it seems as though Putin's Russia, if it continues its present course, will almost have to go rogue. It won't end the war with a negotiated settlement unless something drastic changes, but as attrition whittles down its once vaunted military power, it will be forced to engage in its antebellum tactics, only far more aggressively. It will rely on asymmetric warfare and hybrid operations to destabilize the West. It will increasingly act like a global version of its now closest remaining ally of consequence, Iran, completely decoupled from the international community, pursuing a revanchist foreign policy using drones, proxy wars, missile strikes, espionage, and more, all while using its nuclear umbrella to deter Western retaliation. Nuclear threats will continue to grow in intensity. Cyber operations will increase in kind. Putin will target vulnerable pipelines and transoceanic fiber optic cables. Russia will continue to fund and sponsor disinformation and misinformation campaigns. Russian bots named Peter and Frank will enter your feeds at election times in the hopes of trolling you into voting for their candidate of choice. The bloodletting in Ukraine will continue. The threat of escalation will remain omnipresent. And that isn't good, because as one think tank put it, a rogue Russia still represents a geopolitical crisis of the highest order. It's a threat to global security, Western political systems, the cybersphere, space, and food security, not to mention every Ukrainian civilian. Let's be clear, Ukraine has blunted, if not outright neutered, Russia's conventional military power over the past year. That feat alone is remarkable. But this war won't end anytime soon. Russia remains a dangerous foe, and elsewhere, especially outside Ukraine, the bear can still bite. Make no mistake. So where, outside Ukraine, could the US see itself fighting Russia, and how would it do so? One of the geopolitical hotspots for a possible confrontation between Russia and the US is in a random chunk of territory wedged between Lithuania and Poland, known as the Kaliningrad exclave. This sparsely populated patch of land is Russia's gateway to the Baltic, a heavily defended former German port city ceded to the Soviets in the aftermath of World War II. Kaliningrad's geography is tricky. The port is literally surrounded by NATO countries. Strategically, it's an A2AD, or anti-access area denial nightmare for NATO. Home to thousands of Russian forces, advanced fighter jets, and nuclear-capable Iskander-M missiles, the exclave is connected to Belarus by a narrow 40-mile land bridge known as the Suwalki Gap, which itself cuts into the only two highways and lone railroad connecting Poland to NATO's exposed Baltic states. Since NATO assets cannot traverse the Suwalki Gap without coming under the guns of Russia's military in Kaliningrad, the wide-open rural region is a crucial choke point that Russia would almost certainly exploit if it ever sought to cut off the Baltics from NATO. Finland's accession to NATO has caused tensions in this region to flare once more. In a matter of 1 year, NATO's border with Russia has doubled, adding over 800 miles of densely wooded, difficult-to-patrol tundra. The Baltic Sea has come firmly under NATO's protection, with Kaliningrad the only Russian outpost in an otherwise Western-friendly sea of states. Putin has had grievances against the West for years, and nobody, certainly not now, should bother trying to predict his next move. But prediction and preparation is the express job of America's military strategists. Were Putin to try to secure the Suwalki Gap to Kaliningrad or gain a foothold in Finland, Lithuania, Estonia, or any of its past satellites, the US and its allies must try to discern his regional capabilities and prepare for an open conflict. But what would this look like? How does the Russian way of war differentiate from the American approach? America is fortunate, at least far more fortunate than Russia in this hypothetical. Its robust network of military alliances and partnerships throughout Europe mean it will be far from alone in a war against Russia. Before the war in Ukraine, both Russia and NATO had respected the terms of the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, committing both sides to avoid reinforcing or permanently stationing forces on the territories of the former Warsaw Pact states or their neighboring Russian borders. Russia abrogated itself from these terms when it invaded Ukraine. Now, NATO has a clear pathway to bolster its presence in these critical areas using measured multinational deployments and the increased rotation of permanently based American troops. The fact America's force posture would be complemented by the presence of British, Polish, Italian, Spanish, French, Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Finnish, and many other allied partners speaks to the logic of the American way of war, which in the modern era has become multinational and collaborative to the core. There is strength in numbers and resolve in collective resilience. These force multipliers are not something Russia could count on in a direct confrontation with NATO. In fact, it can only really count on direct, cooperative assistance from Belarus, and amid its attempts to keep out of the Ukraine war, Belarusian loyalty to Russia is an especially unproven commodity. While Russia has struggled to coax Belarus to fight alongside it, NATO's military personnel now exceeds 5.4 million, 4 times that of Russia. According to Statista, NATO also has about 5 times as many aircraft, 4 times as many armored vehicles, and 3 times as many military ships. Not to mention the backing of the world's biggest defense spender, the US itself, with 1.39 million troops alone, and a defense budget of $801 billion in 2021, dwarfing second-place China with a net spend of $293 billion, and Russia, who spent a paltry $65.9 billion that same year. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, each year it conducted massive, multi-day military exercises demonstrating its military power. NATO has done the same, ramping up its collective exercises over the past year in response to Russian aggression. While these exercises show little more than NATO's theoretical military effectiveness, the war in Ukraine has brought Russia into stark relief, and it has certainly been found wanting. Russia is in the midst of a new military reform, something its Ministry of Defense announced at the end of 2022. Most see this as little more than a haphazard attempt to patch a sinking ship. They're trying to grow their modern military to the size it was over 2 decades ago. But today there remains a lack of specialists in charge of maintaining military equipment and vehicles, as well as military infrastructure inherited from the USSR, which no longer exists today. Additionally, there were tens of thousands of auxiliary positions like military financial officers and army construction workers, which have also ceased to exist. In other words, noted Russian military journalist and military analyst Pavel Felgenauer, the nominal size of the armed forces cannot be increased in a realistic and meaningful way. Russia lacks qualified junior officers. There's nobody to command the conscripts they're throwing into battle. The army of 1.5 million soldiers Russia dreams of is little more than a bureaucratic fantasy. Still, Russia is frantically trying to restore its depleted forces to the numbers it boasted prior to the invasion of Ukraine. It isn't working. Its armed forces today are lacking in some areas of modern military technology, including drone capability, electronic components, and radar and satellite reconnaissance, Felgenauer told the media. Yes, we have weapons, but our reconnaissance capabilities are weaker than our attack capabilities. So we have a long-range, sometimes precision-guided weapon, but we don't always know where the target is. But what if Russia went into a full-scale war with the West despite these obvious weaknesses? Let's say for the sake of argument that Putin goes rogue. He sees Finland's NATO membership as the final straw. He still doubts the West will risk starting World War III, and he is desperate for a quick victory in Europe. He throws everything into the Ukrainian cauldron, and it all goes wrong. Armed with Western tanks and eventually aircraft, Ukraine mounts a series of counter-offensives that all but push back Russia to its own borders. Decisively defeated on the battlefield, the enemies of Lukashenko's pro-Russian faction in Belarus stage a coup and oust the leader from power. In the cascading crisis, weathered Belarusian volunteers, which for years had fought in Ukraine, return home and help throw the Russians out of their homeland. Belarus thus switched sides, leaving the Russian garrison at Kaliningrad entirely surrounded by enemy forces. The Suwalki Gap is no longer a concern for the West, but it is for Russia. Over time, Poland, Lithuania, and other NATO countries pressure the Russian garrison to demilitarize. Morale sinks. They are at the whims of NATO naval forces in the Baltic, Swedish missiles on the neighboring island of Gotland, and all but blocked from their homeland. Putin decides the time is ripe to present NATO with a sort of final act. He invades Belarus and, hoping to regain a foothold in Eastern Europe, Putin decides to test NATO's resolve, launching an attack on the Suwalki Gap and small villages along the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian borders. He uses Kaliningrad's Iskander missiles and naval missile corvettes to cover his advance. With the bulk of its reserve forces in Poland and Finland, Putin's forces overwhelm the unprepared NATO multinational garrison in Estonia, which is briefly forced into retreat. Russia immediately begins reinforcing its positions, bracing for the inevitable counterattack as NATO triggers Article 5. NATO's tripwire strategy to place small forward presence battalion-sized deployments in the Baltic to absorb a Russian invasion while it rushed its reserves to the front could not prevent Estonia from coming under Russian control. Latvia looks like it will hold, but only just. But once Estonia fell, all of NATO's Baltic states, supported by its European, American, and Canadian allies, converged. The West has wargamed this scenario over and over again, and Russian units immediately feel pressure from NATO's response force, and Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, a multinational brigade on a constant state of alert. The initial surge into the Baltics is complicated by Russian missile attacks on roads, bridges, and railways. The US and NATO respond by establishing air superiority over Estonia at high risk to itself, beginning with a massive cyber attack and cruise missile strikes launched by a fleet of B-52s on Russian SAM sites that overwhelm their air defenses. Learning the lessons of the Ukraine war, NATO targets Russia's vulnerable logistics infrastructure, supplying its forward Estonian presence. Superior commercial satellites, drone technology, UAVs, electromagnetic capabilities, and next-generation precision-guided munitions fired by interoperable F-35 fighters enable NATO forces to target railway hubs supplying Putin's war in a way the Ukrainians never could. Once Russia gave up their air to NATO and the US, it was essentially game over. Kaliningrad, isolated and completely surrounded, capitulates in a matter of days. NATO continues to pour manpower and material into Estonia at a rate unmatched by Russia. Its theater assets are better maintained. It has higher morale, reinforced by a clear sense of mission. It suffers fewer casualties, a result of superior airlift capabilities and hospital facilities. It engages in full-spectrum multi-domain operations, or the simultaneous attack from sea, air, land, and cyberspace, unleashing a single symphony of violence to break down advanced defenses. It has been trained for years. Through it all, NATO member countries shoulder a fair share of the burden, thus proving the NATO concept. Russian morale breaks under a withering, round-the-clock assault. The war is over in a matter of weeks. Russian forces beat a hasty retreat to Moscow, and Putin's world comes crashing down as his people, fired up after years of disappointment, global isolation, bloodshed, and military setbacks, finally turn on him. Sure, it's all hypothetical, and yes, it's fair to claim that the West has struggled against forces far weaker than the conventional peers they would face in the Baltics over the past few decades. A fair criticism, but one equally applicable to nearly every country immersed in counterinsurgencies and irregular warfare. It's hard to believe that Russia could ever succeed in an out-and-out military confrontation against the West all on its own. If the West applies the full weight of its collective military capabilities on a clearly defined enemy, the outcome for Putin would be very, very bad indeed. His only recourse, again, would be to threaten the world with nuclear destruction. Would he really go that far? What do you think? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. If you go ahead and spin the proverbial wheel of global worry today, there's a good chance you'll land on the words China and World War III. Unfortunately, there are several reasons for that, and they all lead to the question no one wants to think about. Is China getting ready for World War III? It's true that nowadays you can't go far without someone talking about the perils of Taiwanese reunification, artificial Chinese islands, Cold War 2.0, or the specifications of the latest hypersonic missile. Add to that the increasing frequency of Chinese incursions into Taiwanese airspace, Japan's recent decision to purchase hundreds of new weapons for its own defense, like these American-made Tomahawk missiles, and closer military cooperation between the US and Australia, and we are starting to see the signs of another global conflict on the horizon, one that is likely to begin somewhere in the Indo-Pacific. It all adds up to another doomsday scenario waiting in the wings, and some believe it could take place as early as 2024. Does China have a World War III plan in place, and if so, what does it look like? China's rise over the past few decades seems to indicate that the worrisome and likely answer to the first question is yes, and here's why. Tensions between China and the West have not been this high in a long time. Rewind several decades, and many experts would have laughed at you if you claimed you were a time traveler from the future and China posed a serious geopolitical threat to the international order. That's because the 1990s were a strange time, and not just because of the oversized jeans and kids' obsession with green slime. It was a period of untempered Western optimism. Yep, you heard that right, optimism. From our pessimism-soaked vantage point today, the geopolitical arc of that decade was almost unicorn-like, a surreal period of national unity, hope, and security, with the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers. But for a while, things seemed, well, good. Emerging victorious from its 45-year ideological standoff with the Soviet Union, for a brief unipolar moment in time, the United States enjoyed unmatched power and prestige on the global stage. There were no more near-peer threats. While terrorists and revolutionaries conspired at the peripheries of power, America's military and its coalition partners, equipped to the eyeballs with the latest technology and fresh off their rollicking victory in the Persian Gulf, bought into the idea that democracy was spreading and would continue to do so with assistance and persistence around the globe. It was in this geopolitical climate that things really started to change for China, not that many Western observers really noticed. Between 1949 and 1971, it had existed behind the Bamboo Curtain, a totalitarian dictatorship under the authoritarian communist revolutionary Mao Zedong. Things changed when the United States sought rapprochement with China in the 1970s, thereafter reopening diplomatic relations and turning China into a willing Cold War partner through strengthening economic relationships and a degree of exposure to the West it had not enjoyed since World War II. China started modernizing. A lot. Americans profited, China grew. As China grew, Americans hoped the exposure to Western values and ideas would liberalize and democratize China. There were social and cultural reforms amid the modernization, yes, but not many. China's benign growth lulled the West into a false sense of security. Some pundits argue that it was in the 1990s, the heyday of American optimism, that China started really playing the long game, hatching a secret 50-year plan to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation after a century of downturns. Entangling its economy with the United States, it grew fast enough to convince the West it deserved a place in the World Trade Organization, the WTO, something it achieved by the early 2000s. Yes, we will play by the rules of international order, Chinese leaders proclaimed, with enough zeal to make their Western partners proud. It was around then its economy started booming, growing almost 10% every year for the next 2 decades. Between 1980 and 2000, its GDP quadrupled. Starting at under $90 billion in 1980, it now hovers around $13 trillion, the fastest growing increase in human history. Hundreds of millions of Chinese residents were lifted out of poverty as the country's economic potential skyrocketed. As globalization continued and China received hundreds of billions of dollars of global investment, it established a trade footprint to rival much of the rest of the world, providing cheap labor that built most of the products now adorning your home while becoming competitive in cutting-edge cyber, space, and technology sectors. It has long since become East Asia's economic titan par excellence. It thrived under the auspices of global capitalism. It took on some of the trappings of the West, especially in its business and trade practices, but it never really democratized. To this day, it maintains its communist, centralized authoritarian regime under the singular vision of its latest ruler, Xi Jinping. And Xi has a vision, all right. Having covertly flourished under the umbrella of American power for several decades, China is now preparing the next phase of its grand strategy to catapult itself into the realm of peerless global hegemon, one that can impose itself in its Indo-Pacific neighborhood at will while projecting enough global influence to shape the rules-based international order in its own image. It's taken them 14 5-year plans to get to that point, but they've finally arrived. Now China wants to build a community of common destiny, essentially a nice way of saying it wants to coercively achieve what it views the US doing all over the world, leading international organizations, becoming a political and economic model for developing countries, being able to project world-class military power all across the globe, all while leveraging its trade relationships, allies, and partners to achieve its interests, aka replace the United States as the world's leading state. They chose 2049 for the date to achieve all of this, the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, PRC, but each successive milestone for modernization has amped up the tension between China and the West. National security insiders have been sounding alarm bells for a decade now, but only recently have things started to get real. Over the past 3 decades, China has spent its way to military might. In 2019, it was spending more than South Korea, Japan, India, Russia, and Taiwan combined, accounting for over half of Asian GDP and half of all Asian military expenditures. China didn't have to just outspend their competition, however. Over the past decade, a growing number of Western defense officials have started kicking themselves for not realizing the pitfalls of economic interdependence with China. It's been no secret that for decades, Chinese spies have been stealing valuable intellectual property, including US military secrets. Just look at their latest stealth fighter, the J-20. It's a surreal mashup of the latest stealth technology, the type you might get if an American F-22, F-35, and a Russian MiG-144 walked into a bar, had one too many, and started spilling their secrets within earshot of a Chinese spy. China has stolen immense amounts of data too. Some we unwittingly give them by opting in to use Chinese-owned platforms like TikTok, data that US officials claim gives them enough personal information to identify potential targets for intelligence collection and other subterfuge. Just like the West can and probably does, China uses this data to geolocate geolocate top national security targets, recruit spies, conduct massive remote cyber attacks, and steal military and technology secrets. The issue isn't just that China has shiny new advanced submarines, missiles, aircrafts, drones, and other toys to play with. It is that it's now looking like it has the logistics, infrastructure, and know-how to use them effectively. And that's something we need to explore further. As we all know, nation-states can't just fling military power around the globe willy-nilly. You have to have the national industrial base to build up your power, the domestic support to use it, the transport infrastructure to move it, agreements in place to base it, and an effective doctrine and strategy to employ it. It took the United States 4 years of total war and victory in 2 theaters to emerge as a bona fide global superpower after World War II. Were it not for the destabilization in the aftermath of that war and the exigencies of the Cold War that followed it, it would not have many of the military basing agreements or the alliances and partnerships it now enjoys around the world today. Many of those relationships and the infrastructure sustaining them took decades, even generations, to build. And today, that is something we often take for granted. But not China. They know the price of obscurity and the difficulty of restoring national power and prestige back to superpower levels. Their long-term strategy, in part, is to achieve the same degree of global agency that the United States enjoys. It too wants bases for its military all over the world, flourishing economic relationships, and safe trade routes for its commercial fleet. Without a world war to create the conditions for its rise to power, China has had to engineer its rise artificially, partially through guile and subterfuge, partially using state-sponsored initiatives that scream, "We are trying to go global, and we will make it happen whether you like it or not." One of China's global projects that stands out from the rest in terms of ambition, scale, and significance, the One Belt Road Initiative, or Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. Much like the ancient Silk Road that connected Chinese traders and goods with rich foreign markets, the BRI strives to achieve the same degree of global influence for China in the modern era. To understand China, you have to grapple with the BRI. Many analysts view the project as China's answer to the Marshall Plan, a post-World War II economic assistance package that sought to revitalize war-torn Europe. Unlike the Marshall Plan, the BRI is extended to any willing economic partner. Formal agreements between China, the host nation, to build economic and political ties generally precede a litany of Chinese investment, funding, infrastructure projects, tech collaboration, and more. In the process, China gets access to ports and airfields, markets for state-owned companies, safeguards for international trade, and international influence. For years, the BRI has been the litmus test for global Chinese power projection. The belt connects China with Europe and the other dozen nations on its borders via a series of overland trade routes, while the road refers to its maritime interests, fueling stations, ports, industry, infrastructure scattered throughout Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. A great example of periphery diplomacy, BRI projects can now be found from the Himalayas to the Horn of Africa and Mediterranean basin. It has funded infrastructure deals in Malaysia, gas pipelines and railroads in Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Kenya, maintains port operations in Greece, projects in Sri Lanka, and has other projects in the works. The West has viewed the BRI warily. Some criticize China's debt trap diplomacy, a tactic of luring economically vulnerable states into taking out Chinese loans and then jacking up the rates to unpayable levels as a form of coercion over the government in question. Others fear China's growing telecommunications and economic influence over Europe and the global South. But there still hasn't been a really unified response, and China continues to shovel money into its initiative, with another $124 billion pledged in 2017. One of the big warning signs came that same year, when China decided to establish a hub in Djibouti, a developing nation strategically located in the Gulf of Aden on the Horn of Africa. China had essentially said it would never open an official military base there, and then they did, calling it a logistics facility, even though PLA Navy Marines and other forces regularly mull about with armored vehicles and artillery. It is considering similar projects in Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, United Arab Emirates, Kenya, Seychelles, Tanzania, Angola, and Tajikistan, evidence of China's expanding military footprint around the globe. These military bases hold great potential for regional destabilization. Such developments are a warning that countries can become unwitting partners to PRC military expansion by giving China access to airfields and ports it would otherwise lack. A global footprint, therefore, is a prerequisite for China's national rejuvenation and has certainly empowered its actions at home. Maritime disputes in the waters around China are so common they've almost become normalized. These waters in the South China Sea are heavily trafficked, including some of the richest shipping lanes in the world. Xi Jinping made a promise not to militarize certain islands China artificially built in the South China Sea. Now the Parcel and Spratly Islands are militarized and can be used to intimidate and coerce coastal states throughout the region. The bullying continues in the East China Sea as Chinese merchant vessels regularly dominate lucrative shipping lanes. Coast Guard, military, and commercial ships deprive foreign fishermen of access to resources, and policymakers make ambitious maritime claims that are are frequently rejected as lacking basis in international law. For the record, territorial waters are considered up to 12 nautical miles off a country's coastline, a fact China ignores. China wants to monopolize the natural gas, oil, and hydrocarbon reserves it feels it has a claim to, even hundreds of miles away. A lot of the tension arises near the Senkaku Islands, a group of uninhabited islands that in 1971 reverted back to Japanese administrative control under the Okinawa Reversion Agreement. Over these seas, China has set out to create air defense identification zones, increasing its operational reach even further. Taken together, China's economic and cultural influence combined with its renewed military strength add up into a scary equation for Beijing's neighbors. There have also been regular border conflicts on the China-India frontier since a PRC-instigated clash in 2020 left dozens dead. India claims China has the onus to withdraw. They haven't. South Korea is worried about North Korea, China's only major Asian ally, doing something stupid. Even Japan, those guys who were so committed to pacifism after World War II that they called their military a self-defense force, are now so alarmed they're arming themselves with hundreds of Tomahawk missiles, writing counter-strike capabilities into their fighting doctrine, and conducting joint military exercises with American and Australian forces, an image that surely would have made our grandparents both proud and perplexed. And nobody should be more scared than Taiwan. The small independent island nation will almost undoubtedly be ground zero in any World War III scenario with China. Here's why. China is bent on reuniting Taiwan with mainland China. The spat goes back to World War II, when nationalist rebels fled to the island and created a vibrant democratic society, one China refuses to acknowledge or respect. Ever since, China has wanted Taiwan back more than a prepubescent teen who accidentally traded their holographic first edition Charizard for a bag of potato chips. And this is a problem, since the United States has all but formally pledged to intervene and protect Taiwan in the event China decides to invade. And boy, has it probably thought about it. In August 2022, the China State Council produced a white paper whose table of contents made China's position on the issue explicitly clear. Chapter 1. Taiwan is part of China. This is an indisputable fact. Chapter 2. Resolute efforts of the CCP to realize China's complete reunification. Chapter 3. China's complete reunification is a process that cannot be halted. Chapter 4. National reunification in a new era. Chapter 5. Bright prospects for a peaceful reunification. It's okay, you can tell us how you really feel, Beijing. We are one China, the paper alleges, and Taiwan is part of China. This is an indisputable fact supported by history and the law. Taiwan has never been a state. Its status as part of China is unalterable. The CPC is committed to the historic mission of resolving the Taiwan question and realizing China's complete reunification. So China is overwhelmingly focused on reunifying Taiwan. They say they won't use force. Where have we heard that before? Authoritarian leader claims he won't use force to reunify territory he believes is rightfully his. But hey, this type of tension has been brewing since the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, when the PRC had a showdown with an American carrier group after conducting a bunch of missile tests in the Taiwan Strait. The outcome of the Taiwan issue has real global bearings. Taiwan is the epicenter of the global semiconductor industry. What's a semiconductor, you say? Anything that has an electronic chip. Your phone, your computer, your wireless modem, your electronic toys, your average ballistic missile, medical instruments, televisions, cutting-edge satellites, they all rely on semiconductors for computing. It is a $556 billion industry, one that for better or for worse hinges on the whims of a Taiwan-China-US love triangle. You see, the US sells 46% of global semiconductors, but only manufactures 12% of them. China consumes the most, importing $378 billion worth and putting what it buys into 35% of the world's devices. And Taiwan, as you might expect, has 53% of the global semiconductor market share and produces 90% of the world's most advanced ones you might see in cars, smartphones, and military tech. That's a serious share of the market. Interdependence is a problem. The US is now trying to decouple itself from the Taipei-Beijing chip drama and become self-sufficient. But Taiwan's predominance on the global chip market is one reason Beijing literally cannot afford to let Taiwan continue to independently exist. It needs to set the terms of trade in the region, not Taiwan and other Western-facing nations. Otherwise, it will always be seen as a second-rate power. What does this all amount to? Well, this situation has produced the worst security crisis in the Taiwan Strait in 20 years. China means business. As Taiwan becomes more eager to carve out its independence from the mainland, China views its very sovereign existence as an existential threat. China worries about being hamstrung behind the first island chain, a series of nations that includes the Philippines, Borneo, Japan, and the Ryukyu Islands, that it fears can contain and limit its ability to project power beyond its shores. Taiwan is at the heart of this island chain. a cornerstone of Western power in the region, one that perpetually transmits dangerously subversive messages of Western-backed prosperity while it remains independent. With Taiwan under America's orbit, it is a thorn in Xi's side. With a reunified Taiwan, China gains the ability to break the first island chain and wield influence deep into the Pacific. Predictably, China is throwing caution to the wind regarding Taiwan's territorial sovereignty, violating Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone (ADIZ) and the median line dividing the Taiwan Strait, once considered as an invisible barrier between the two entities with frightful regularity. Between 1954 and 2020, there were only 4 Chinese violations of these internationally recognized demarcations. In 2020 alone, there were 380. There were more than double that number the following year with 969 incursions. The biggest came on October 4th, 2021, a day that saw 56 aircraft enter Taiwan's air defense zone, unironically coinciding with China's National Day of celebration. By May of this year, there had been a 50% increase in the number of incursions over the same span in 2021. Partially to send a supportive signal in response, the US conducted a series of high-profile political visits to the island. China didn't buy it. To them, the visits were needlessly escalatory. They responded with more overflights, setting a new record for monthly sorties. Since the summer, the PLA Air Force, PLAF, has flown over 1,000 sorties near Taiwan, 40% of them in the ADIZ or over the median line. Today, it is coming into Taiwanese airspace on a near-daily basis, ramping up its intimidation efforts around Taiwan in other ways too, from anti-submarine warfare, drone reconnaissance, and cyber attacks to the growth of its naval and missile presence in the region. China's end goal is clear. Taiwan has voiced alarm and concern over the near-constant encirclement drills, labeling them as escalatory, equivalent of a sea and air blockade of the island. If these are, in fact, dress rehearsals for a full-scale invasion, China will continue to ramp up the pressure as the time goes on. The on-ramp to war, then, is there, and it's volatile. Some pundits compare the existing slate of geopolitical relationships in the Indo-Pacific to the entangled alliance systems in Europe on the eve of World War I. This is, at least, a line of reasoning. Hal Brands, a prominent political scientist at Johns Hopkins University, has espoused comparing Japanese, Australian, and American collaboration as a latter-day triple entente, the pre-World War coalition that sought to contain Imperial Germany in the Western Pacific. It didn't take much for the World War I powder keg to erupt in the Balkans, fueling a chain reaction that resulted in the First World War. If history is any guide, it won't take much to escalate a regional clash in the Indo-Pacific into a global war either. It is here in Asia's maritime heartland where all the ingredients of a global cataclysm are conspiring against the post-Cold War period of peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. One analyst observed, "It's also here where the naked edge of China's hegemonic ambitions are on full display, with dire consequences for smaller neighbors and the broader liberal international order. Here lies the defining geopolitical dilemma of our times." Well put. So how are the major players gearing up to play their part? We've already talked about China, at least their geopolitical maneuvering. Militarily, they've been following the same path, modernizing at an impressive rate to add bite to their bark as they pursue their strategy of recasting the global governance system in its own image. Its to-do list has, so far, taken a page right out of America's playbook. China has adopted the model that made America powerful, first building a moderately prosperous society in all respects, then using that as a foundation to build a truly competitive, world-class military. The fusion of civil-military power is deliberate. Industrial developments in quantum computing, AI, robotics, and biotechnology not only help China become competitive in the civilian sphere, these technologies can be appropriated to help the Chinese network their military forces. And make no mistake, this is something it is eagerly doing. To create a state-of-the-art air force, it has set a goal to fully network its combined and joint chains of command by 2027. Advancing dual-use technologies, ones that can benefit civilian and military infrastructure alike, will enable rapid information exchange between its army, navy, air, rocket, and yes, even space forces, easily setting the Chinese military apart from anything America's nearest peer, the Russians, have been able to achieve in Ukraine if they succeed. For a while now, the CCP has portrayed a West in relative decline. This narrative fuels Beijing's hopes it can supplant the United States as the preeminent global superpower. And to be fair, things in the United States haven't been all that peachy over the past decade or so. Race riots, populism, rampant misinformation and fake news, capital uprisings, COVID, political polarization, mistrust, and fear have exposed internal fractures and brought American democracy to its weakest point in generations. But America has been gearing up for its marathon clash against China for years now, in the hopes that if things did spill over into a full-scale war, it would be ready. American leaders, regardless of political party, are now mostly unified on this. They know the coming struggle will be ideological and cultural as much as it will be an in-and-out technological, economic, and military competition. Still, it wasn't really until 2018 2018 that the United States officially changed its strategic posture to address China's rise. At the tail end of 2 fruitless decades in the Middle East, its national strategy shifted to recognize China, not terrorists or Russia, as the main peer adversary. This year, the Biden administration updated its national security strategy but did not depart from the rhetoric or strategic competition that pervaded earlier iterations. American strategy emphasizes this as the decisive decade, to get ahead and win the competition for the 21st century. Some people criticize American strategy for reviving antiquated Cold War mentalities, painting over Soviet tropes with Chinese skins in another zero-sum adversarial competition that could needlessly escalate into war. Vastly different political systems aside, there are more similarities than differences between China and the United States than there were between the US and the Soviet Union, especially in the realm of economics. The two competing powers are not mutually exclusive, but disagreements and mistrust are common enough destabilizers that many fear the status quo can't be maintained for long. China is aware that it still cannot compete with the United States in many areas. The United States Navy, for instance, though technically smaller than the Chinese Navy, continues to patrol strategic waterways in the Indo-Pacific, ensuring vital sea lanes remain open for free and flourishing international trade. American carrier groups have bases throughout the first island chain. American submarines and aircraft tend to be more robust, possessing longer range and better stealth technology than their Chinese counterparts. Chinese jet engines are not as advanced as American ones. Its military suffers quality control issues with its imbalanced admixture of antiquated and modern military systems and vehicles. Its logistics and transport capabilities lag far behind their globe-trotting American adversary. And above all, the Chinese lack concrete fighting experience, having fought and lost their last major operation in Vietnam in 1979. Experience the United States coming off its own unfortunate Middle Eastern odyssey nevertheless has in spades. But the PLA's military strategy is catered to overcome these shortcomings. In a World War III scenario, especially one involving Taiwan, the United States, its allies and partners, namely Japan, South Korea, Singapore, the Philippines, and possibly India, would have to operate in China's neck of the woods at the tail end of an incredibly long logistics network. The United States' geographic location makes it reliant on small overseas bases, refueling tankers, transport vehicles, and carriers to convey and sustain its units abroad. While China continues modernizing its forces and develops its own expeditionary capabilities, it has developed an anti-access area denial (A2AD) strategy to keep America and its allies at bay in the Indo-Pacific. The strategy has seen China prioritize the construction of a bristling array of ground-based missiles, naval assets, and aircraft equipped with the latest air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles that can outrange their American counterparts, and thus discourage them from intervening in a regional conflict. This active defense strategy will make American intervention in Taiwan both risky and potentially deadly. Is all of this really leading to a future world war? Most security experts will be the first to tell you that the war against China is anything but inevitable. If both powers can learn to manage their competitive relationship, they can peacefully coexist despite their adversarial posture. But wars can ignite from inauspicious sources. As Peter Warren Singer, a strategist and senior fellow at a think tank called New America and award-winning author, has written, in the coming decades, a war might ignite accidentally, such as by 2 opposing warships trading paint near a reef not even marked on a nautical chart, or it could slow burn and erupt as a reordering of the global system in the late 2020s, a period at which China's military buildup is on pace to match the US. Singer has spent a lot of time thinking about the type of war we might expect in the Pacific. The war, he argues, will be a multi-domain conflict, meaning it will transpire in the traditional domains of air, sea, and land, as well as futuristic domains like space, the lifeblood of modern military communications, and cyber, where digital military systems and civilian infrastructure may be prone to attack. The United States has not waged a multi-domain war against a peer adversary since 1945, and so many of the lessons it learned in Iraq and Afghanistan may not be as relevant to a war with China. Likewise, America's traditional approach to wars has been to overmatch its enemies, relying on military technology at least one generation ahead to produce qualitative advantages on the battlefield. US forces can't count on overmatch in the future, Singer argues, since much of America's intellectual property has been stolen outright by Chinese spies, while its R&D has been accelerating its experimentation with space, drone, hypersonic, and cyber technologies. Still, experimentation is not the same as full-scale acquisition and implementation. China's two biggest vulnerabilities are historically significant, that it is reliant on imported semiconductors and microchips, things it cannot produce itself, and second, that it is heavily reliant on imported oil. The situation is not unlike Japan's in the early 20th century, a rapidly modernizing imperial power with a plucky navy totally reliant on oil imports to sustain itself. As it started to expand into China and the Pacific, seeking access to raw resources, the United States embarked the export of oil and other military goods. Pearl Harbor, the start of the last war for the United States fought in the Pacific, came in part because Japanese leaders viewed the war with the United States as inevitable. It needed an independent oil supply, something it would seek in the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, and it knew if it attacked, the US would come knocking, so it needed to prevent its own geopolitical encirclement by striking a knockout blow on the American fleet, then stationed at Pearl Harbor. It had a narrow window, given its limited oil reserves at home, and so they attacked. Some say another Pearl Harbor is brewing, this time with Taiwan at the epicenter. Reunifying the island by force will give China access to the semiconductors it needs, but it would have to ensure that the United States could not meaningfully intervene. Toshi Yoshihara, a China expert who works at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment, has warned that the PLA's views on a Pacific conflict are consistent with Pearl Harbor, and that they are predisposed to delivering a decisive first blow against US-deployed forces in the Western Pacific, particularly those in Japan. Chinese doctrine indeed emphasizes surprise at the outset of war, all part of a counter-intervention strategy to keep the Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, Nanjing, Guangzhou, Shenzhen corridor open. Its precision strike arsenal, primarily made up of DF-21C missiles, are capable of hitting any target on the entire Japanese archipelago, while its DF-26 missiles can fire conventional and nuclear warheads almost 4,000 kilometers, far enough to strike the strategic US base at Guam. In all likelihood, if it were to spring an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, China's tactic would be to saturate America's roving carrier groups and their escorts with waves of ballistic anti-ship missiles, overcome their defenses, and send billions of dollars of valuable equipment to the bottom of the ocean before it can be brought to bear. This would help overcome the early gulf in military shipping, aircraft, and tonnage between the two sides. They would then target vulnerable American sensor aircraft, refueling tankers, and cargo ships to curtail America's ability to get close to Chinese territory. The United States has far more battle force missiles than the Chinese, meaning the total number of missiles capable of being fired in combat before resupply, but the Chinese do have enough to saturate and destroy 3 American carrier groups simultaneously, potentially turning the American naval forces in the Pacific into a moot point before a war begins. There is even evidence that they have been practicing such preemptive strikes in the Gobi Desert in western China. Such a move might be good in the short term, but short-term tactical victories do not win wars. China would then have to contend with the galvanization of American morale, the mobilization of its entire economy for war, and the possibility of intervention from many of its regional and global partners, one of whom is Japan, the world's 3rd largest economy with a powerful navy of its own. If China went to war, it would be anything but subtle. For an operation that big in the 21st century, it's almost impossible to achieve the element of surprise. Observers would see a flurry of activity in China's eastern and southern theater commands opposite Taiwan for weeks and even months prior to invasion. Ports of embarkation, airfields, field hospitals, and mobile command posts buzzing, units deploying with oil and gas pipelines, transport ships loading, commercial ships looking to provoke and escalate. The forces far from Taiwan would be placed on high alert. National mobilization efforts would increase, and the military would begin commandeering civilian vessels, ferries, aircrafts, trucks, and trains. China would have to surge its production of ballistic long-range missiles and cruise missiles for a massive anti-air, anti-ship, air-to-air, and beach bombardment. It would need to achieve a degree of economic self-sufficiency in anticipation for the sanctions that would undoubtedly be implemented. It would be a lot like what we saw in Ukraine with Russian forces massing on the border, not unlike a classic game of Risk. You mass on your enemy's border, you claim you come in peace, you are only there to defend yourself, you claim. Meanwhile, battle plans are circulating, and you are one move away from starting World War III. What's next? Unlike the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, who failed to authorize a 3rd strike to neutralize the American carrier and submarine fleet, the Chinese would have to find a way to continually pressure the Americans in the Pacific to deter further intervention. Making it so prohibitively costly, its morale and will to assist Taiwan would crumble. An invasion of Taiwan would be tantamount to Germany's invasion of the Rhineland in 1936. Unless the West is willing to stand up and deter Chinese aggression from the start, an invasion could spark emergency rearmament programs, mass mobilization, and quickly escalate into a global war. Xi and the CCP are no fools, however. They know it would be a Rubicon moment if they were to invade Taiwan, something they could never walk back from. They will have been watching Putin's adventure in Ukraine with great interest, observing firsthand how aggressive regional land grabs can spiral into an out-and-out, no-holds-barred contest against deceptively capable nations with Western backing. They know if they act, they will immediately forfeit their national image abroad and become international pariahs. In the end, China will have to figure out what ultimate victory would look like, and if it will be worth the price of an all-out war. The ball is already in their court. Reunifying Taiwan by force is a massive obstacle. Overturning an entire global order is even harder by an order of magnitude. Could China do it? Is war really inevitable? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
The geopolitical relationships between the world's greatest powers are at their lowest point in decades. The two-year conflict between Russia and Ukraine has resulted in Western countries being embroiled in war, if indirectly. The proxy warfare between NATO and Russia, and by extension China, is strangely reminiscent of the Cold War. It's no surprise that experts are starting to ask the big question: could a nuclear war actually be about to happen? The US has been preparing for this scenario since all the way back in the 1960s, and should a war break out, it was decided, somewhat grimly, that certain states would be used as a nuclear sponge, absorbing the bulk of the opposing nuclear warheads so the country as a whole would have a greater chance to survive. And this isn't just a US plan. Similar strategies have been implemented by nuclear-bearing countries around the world. We'll get to know how the US decided which states would be put on the nuclear chopping block, but first it's best to start at the very beginning. It all began with experiments by Pierre and Marie Curie, showing that there existed elements, namely uranium and radium, that contained huge stores of potential energy waiting to be unleashed. The renowned Italian physicist Enrico Fermi then showed that he could produce vast amounts of radiation energy by bombarding uranium with neutrons. The concept of nuclear fission materialized in 1938 when German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann detected barium as a result of uranium neutron bombardment, with scientists confirming that barium was being made by the uranium atom splitting into different elements. The scientists correctly predicted that since the resulting elements contained fewer total neutrons, the reaction also produced free neutrons, which had the capacity to chain the reaction in additional uranium elements. Also, the reaction released vast amounts of energy as it removed the strong nuclear bonds that hold the atoms together. The discovery was quickly recognized as a potential tool for both energy production and destruction. But fortunately for the US and all of the Allied powers in World War II, the German physicists responsible for the nuclear developments were being actively driven out of Germany by the Nazi regime. It would take a letter from Albert Einstein to President Roosevelt on August 2, 1939, to officially alert the American government to the threat posed by nuclear weapons to both the US and the entire world. Since Einstein outlined that the German scientists had the potential to develop the nuclear bomb in the near future, the US government decided to spearhead its own nuclear research program to counter the threat. This led to the start of the Manhattan Project in 1942, one of the costliest US military and research programs of the 20th century. The Manhattan Project was ultimately considered a purely defensive measure, an attempt to create weapons that would not be used as a way to necessarily destroy the enemy, but as a show of force that would deter future aggression. Ultimately, the Manhattan Project led to the successful development of a nuclear bomb, with two functional prototypes, Little Boy and Fat Man, that were detonated above the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing an estimated 200,000 people. This effectively removed Japan from World War II. However, while the bombs ended up being the only examples of nuclear weapons used in combat, this was only the beginning of widespread nuclear proliferation. Suddenly, all of the world's greatest powers were vying for the technological and industrial capacity to build nuclear arms. Why did everyone want them? Well, if you didn't have access to a nuclear bomb and the other side did, you were at a significant disadvantage in any potential conflict. This created a paradoxical approach where countries would develop and stockpile significant nuclear weapons to deter other countries who had their own stockpiles into launching theirs. The nuclear strategy for many countries was ultimately referred to as mutually assured destruction, or MAD, with weapons stockpiles large enough to hopefully negate an opposing force's nuclear capacity before it could be deployed. After World War II, America emerged as one of the world's largest economies, cutting its unemployment rate from 25% before the war to just 2% after, and nearly tripling its GDP from $80 billion to $230 billion. The country put its economic prosperity into developing more weapons for its defense, allocating a sizable 10% of its budget to the military, a figure way above many other countries in the world, which never really stopped, although current figures are in the 4% range. This led to the US having close to 30,000 nuclear warheads in its stockpiles by 1964, compared to Russia's 5,200. This was around the same time as the Cuban Missile Crisis, which ultimately led to the US and the USSR signing the Partial Test Ban Treaty, greatly reducing the capacity for testing and therefore developing new nuclear weapons. The ban on testing bombs above ground and underwater didn't deter countries from making more nuclear weapons, though. By 1986, Russia's stockpile was close to 40,000 nuclear warheads, and while the US was decommissioning some of its own, it still had around 22,000 weapons. For reference, the 5 other nuclear-armed countries, the UK, France, China, Israel, and South Africa, had fewer than 1,000 warheads combined at the time. The main launching platform for nuclear weapons in the 20th century was the ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles, which could house and detonate a nuclear warhead thousands of miles away and strike key tactical and strategic locations of an opposing force in the event of war. ICBMs could conceivably be used from submarines, making them able to strike virtually any target on the planet. This meant that potentially nowhere was truly safe from a nuclear attack. To mitigate the threat of nuclear weapons and achieve total dominance, the US concocted a plan to centralize its nuclear stockpiles in areas away from major population centers on the American east and west coasts. Ultimately, this meant that during the Cold War, 7 states would contain the bulk of nuclear missile silos: Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Missouri. Since ICBMs are stored underground, the reasoning of the American government was that keeping the weapons in locations away from major political centers of the country would force an opponent, chiefly the USSR, into focusing the brunt of its nuclear weapons on the silos. But why was this even considered as a strategy? Wouldn't it have been more effective for the Soviets to drop the bomb in the middle of Manhattan or Washington, D.C.? The answer to that is a bit complicated. The ICBMs were designed as a counter-threat to the Soviet nuclear weapons. In the event of a nuclear war, all the available ICBMs could be deployed within a few hours, hopefully annihilating the enemy stockpiles, and thus preventing them from doing the same to the US. As such, the US government considered that the ICBMs themselves were most likely to be the primary target for the enemy to attack. If the Soviets expended all of their weapons to attack the country's population centers, they would be open to a counterattack on their own population centers. This would fully exemplify the mutually assured destruction tactic. There were 2 primary ICBM types that were siloed in these states. The first, Atlas, is a long-range missile with a range of around 8,700 miles, while its successor, the Titan I and then later the Titan II, had an effective range of roughly 9,300 miles. For reference, the distance between Pierre, South Dakota, and Moscow is about 5,100 miles, when taking the shortest route over the Arctic. As such, both types of missiles had more than enough range to strike pretty much any major city across the Soviet Union, with Moscow likely being among the first targets. The states that the ICBMs were stationed in had a few geographical advantages over the major population centers in the US too. The first is related to them being roughly in the center of the US, being relatively far away from both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. Since the US anticipated that the most likely attack with nuclear weapons would come from submarines or marine carriers, this meant that the enemy would need to get relatively close to the US waters to attack. Their being away from the coast also meant that nuclear weapons had a longer time to travel, giving the US aerial defense systems more opportunities to detect and hopefully neutralize the threat that came from the weapons. And since the states weren't that populous to begin with and had plenty of available land, silos could be placed strategically across them as to not interfere with the people and industrial centers that were there. This meant that these states were ultimately seen as necessary sacrifices for the greater good of the country as a whole. If the Soviets were to launch nuclear weapons, they would likely have no other choice but to try to attack the silos that carried American nukes. This meant that even if they managed to neutralize American nuclear weapons, the rest of the country would still have most of its military and naval force to continue fighting traditional warfare. And since the ICBM silos were quickly identified to be among the first possible targets that the Soviets would hit, the US government could allocate more resources and land to create effective defenses for them. The silos were buried underground with a multi-layer system. Ideally, each silo was designed to require multiple missile strikes to eliminate. Through that, the US hoped that the Soviets would exhaust all of their available nuclear weaponry trying to take out the silos instead of distributing them across US population centers. This would give the rest of the country enough time to regroup and launch a counteroffensive. And since the US was allied with most of Western Europe at the time, they could come to America's aid by declaring war and invading the Soviet Union alongside American forces. But the US government didn't stop there. While the 7 states were ultimately designed to be the first target of nuclear attacks, other strategies were put in place to minimize the losses both in the states and across the continental US. First off, the National Highway System was designed in 1956 to evacuate all the major cities across the US. The plan was exercised over the next 13 years, costing more than $30 billion to implement, making it one of the most expensive public work endeavors in American history. Initially, the highway was specifically designed with signage and routes that would help people escape the cities in case of an enemy attack. The dedicated signs would notify the drivers what exactly to do in case of an enemy attack. But the highway was more than just a method of evacuation. Perhaps even more importantly, the roads were designed to provide the US Army with a quick way to travel between the two coasts on land, connecting the defensive systems on the Atlantic and the Pacific coasts of the country. To bolster this capability, some roads are routed close to key military complexes, such as the I-10 and the I-70, for the 1st Armored Division and the 1st Infantry Division, respectively. Of course, since the nuclear attack actually never came, the highway system was eventually changed slightly to better accommodate the people who were using them. The highways allowed people to travel further for work, essentially giving rise to the American suburbs, helping to broaden the American economy and effectively spread out the most populous cities across a larger area. As such, the signage for what to do in the event of a nuclear attack was eventually removed. The growth of the suburbs and the ease of movement across the US also had a secondary effect of helping to move some people out of the biggest population centers and into the countryside. This meant that more people would hopefully be out of the cities if the Soviets decided to drop a nuclear missile on the US during the Cold War. This created a new form of nuclear defense strategy as one through decentralization. It meant that the US could better withstand enemy attacks, which could also apply to traditional warfare and invasions. But the same principle also applies to natural disasters. Any loss of life could be minimized through rapid evacuation and the fact that more people were already outside of the city centers. The second method that the US government used was teaching citizens under potential threat of an attack a duck and cover policy. Children were instructed to hide under tables or any other object to try and avoid debris, while families that could afford it were building nuclear shelters in their basements or away from their homes. The policy also instituted municipal nuclear shelters that were open to the public in the event of an attack. These were based on the notion that the Soviet weaponry would not catastrophically decimate the American population, giving people a chance to hide and rebuild in the aftermath. To bring the idea closer to home, the Federal Civil Defense Administration, or the FCDA, recommended that families should keep a 7-day supply of food and water nearby in case of war. The initiative was helpfully dubbed Grandma's Pantry, with slogans such as "Grandma was always ready for an emergency." The ideal pantry, a stockpile of the most necessary foods, was showcased across the country in stores, exhibits, and fairs, giving the idea broader coverage. However, the idea of keeping a 7-day stockpile of food and water on hand wasn't quite as feasible as the government had hoped, largely due to the fact that most food items at the time were perishable. This meant that the families would likely need to spend significantly more time, energy, and budget to restock and keep reusing the recommended foods. Perhaps more importantly, most pantries existed inside homes on the ground level. In case of a nuclear attack, the average American home wouldn't fare well and would likely be destroyed, taking Grandma's Pantry right along with it. Ultimately, the population realized that keeping up with the idea was counterproductive and more effective designs needed to be put into effect. The US Department of Agriculture was determined to create foods that could be safely stored for prolonged periods without spoiling. One of the first such foods was the all-purpose survival cracker, which was essentially a bulgur wheat biscuit. General Mills also developed multi-purpose food, a granulated synthetic protein mixture that could be combined with water to create a nutritious meal, at least theoretically. The mixture had a sand-like texture and could hardly even be called food by conventional standards, but it contained most of the necessary vitamins and minerals that could sustain a person for a while. The package that the mixture was sold in contained 24 pint-sized water cans, allowing a person to survive for 2 weeks on one pack. The FCDA estimated that it would take roughly 2 weeks for the radiation levels to drop enough for people to go out of their shelters to try and find food. While both types of disaster foods were relatively popular and sold in significant numbers, many people also resorted to more traditional canned food options. The other defensive strategy was to popularize and encourage building nuclear shelters. The government ran a survey in 1961 to determine existing buildings which could be readily converted into nuclear shelters to minimize the cost of building new ones. There was consensus that those in the direct blast would likely stand little chance of survival, but that many casualties could be prevented through effective shelters being built across the country away from the densely populated areas. Another idea was to provide the population with relevant information on how to build a dedicated private nuclear shelter, ideally with 2 to 3 feet of concrete shielding. The government handed out pamphlets with step-by-step instructions. When combined, the private and public shelters were theorized to be able to save 50 million Americans from a nuclear strike. Going any further and building fully reinforced nuclear shelters en masse would have cost the government too much, especially considering that it was spending significant amounts on defense already. This meant that the nuclear shelters were ultimately a half measure designed to curb panic and provide potential relief by giving people an opportunity to save themselves or roll the dice. This brings us back to the idea of why the US government decided to place its nuclear weapon silos where it did in the first place. The perceived main advantage that the US could use in the event of nuclear war was that of geography. Due to a significantly lopsided population distribution, the cities in the center of the continental US were seen as the least of all evils, minimizing the potential life loss and the resulting political fallout. So, would any of this planning actually have made a difference? Since the threat of nuclear war prompted both sides of the Cold War to fully commit to the idea of mutually assured destruction, ultimately this created the illusion of absolute safety. The stockpiling of missiles in the states in the Great Plains only served to enhance this assurance. In the event of total nuclear war, the US hoped that the Soviet Union would exhaust most of its weapons in trying to eliminate the American nuclear capabilities, thus ensuring that the rest of the country could be relatively safe. The key word here is relatively, because even if the Soviets amassed all their weapons to destroy the stockpiles, the rest of the country would still receive potentially deadly doses of radiation. If a missile stockpile were to be bombed by nuclear weapons, the Soviets would likely commit 2 nuclear warheads per silo to ensure that the surrounding shielding is pierced. The bombs will be detonated close to the ground for maximum effect, and the resulting shockwave will create an implosive effect that sucks in dirt from the ground and mixes it with radioactive particles from the weapon itself. The vaporized mixture forms the telltale mushroom cloud, which can rise for miles and get swept away by the wind. High-altitude winds would carry the fission materials for hundreds or even thousands of miles, rapidly spreading radioactivity throughout North America. While most studies conducted during the Cold War focused on the nuclear fallout of a single or relatively few nuclear strikes, they confirmed that the winds could play a vital role in making parts of the North American continent virtually inhospitable for days following the nuclear explosions. Current simulations, using advanced computational capabilities and more accurate predictive models, paint an even more harrowing picture. Scientists from Princeton University used historical records of wind speeds and directions on several days in 2021 to map out the fallout dispersal in the event of nuclear war. The scenario they concocted was of an 800-kiloton bomb being dropped on each of the 450 silos located in 3 key Air Force bases. For reference, Little Boy, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, had an approximate power of 15 kilotons, so they were looking at one 50 times bigger. According to their calculations, a concerted nuclear attack on the silos could kill between around 340,000 and 4.6 million people in the first 4 days. However, the adverse effects could be felt by people living in Canada or Mexico, depending on which way the wind blows in the immediate aftermath of the attack. Even a more moderate scenario predicts that the entire US population would receive more radiation than the current allotted yearly limit for the public. In a simulated worst-case scenario with variable and high winds, the whole of continental North America could potentially receive a deadly dose of radiation. The simulation itself doesn't account for the actual radioactive material of the bomb at the detonation site. This would result in the populations close to the silos having a near universal 100% death rate in the weeks following the nuclear attack. Of course, the simulation can only do so much to predict the actual death toll in the event of an attack, and the results have shown to vary greatly depending on the weather patterns. Furthermore, the simulation has limited itself to a single large bomb being dropped on each of the silos. The current Russian nuclear arsenal has at least 700 nuclear warheads, with a power rated at 800 kilotons or greater. This would mean that if Russia was adamant on cutting off the American nuclear arsenal at its core, the actual scale and power of the attack would be greater than the one shown in the simulation. The worst-case scenario from Princeton could turn out to be only a middling one. This is all based on the assumption that Russia would indeed only target the nuclear-bearing silos located in Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, Montana, and North Dakota, states that currently host them, as the spread of silos was further reduced after the plan's inception. However, more recent estimates show that the US contains far more eligible targets for a nuclear attack than just silos. A map published in 2015 by CBS, though, claims that the warheads would have a much wider dispersal, with many being aimed at the largest cities and metropolitan areas, including New York, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Houston, Chicago, Dallas-Fort Worth, Miami, and Philadelphia. The map also showcases the location of over 90 nuclear power plants in the US, which are primarily located in the eastern states that house roughly 80% of the country's total population. These could be very well considered auxiliary targets, since the nuclear fuel could be detonated with a smaller bomb to emulate a larger one. effectively enhancing the initial strike with more radioactive material and spreading fallout farther away. One of the map's supposed resources for the data, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, or FEMA, claims that it hasn't produced an official map, but that it regularly updates pamphlets with instructions on how to prepare for a catastrophe, including nuclear explosions. This means that the US government is still perceiving the threat of nuclear war as something very real, even if the actual likelihood of Putin dropping bombs on America is low. Which brings us to today, where the current geopolitical situation on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation policies is also at an all-time low. The world powers worked closely during and immediately after the Cold War, disbanding most of its nuclear weaponry. The policies had a marked effect on reducing the number of nuclear warheads from over 76,000 in the mid-80s to around 12,500 today. However, the previous decade of political tension between China, NATO, Russia, India, Pakistan, and the Middle East has largely degraded these non-proliferation pacts. Only one such policy remains, the New START, which limits the US and Russia in how many nuclear warheads they could deploy in their armed forces. However, Putin announced that Russia would discontinue its participation in the policy, preventing NATO from inspecting Russian nuclear weapons facilities and capabilities, as well as stop notifying the US about new nuclear warhead developments. The country's foreign ministry has announced that Russia would continue to abide by the policy's warhead quantity limits and would notify the US on launches. With the New START ending in 2026, there are only 2 more years where the US will have meaningful information about Russia's nuclear arsenal, and even that information has become limited from Russia's suspension and notifications and preventing NATO inspections. After that, the major nuclear powers of the world will become disconnected once again, potentially plunging into another Cold War. Only this time, Putin is determined to unite former Soviet countries together and might stop at nothing to achieve this plan. Even a limited nuclear exchange between the biggest players would have transformative effects on the entire world. As little as 100 detonations centered on the biggest cities could drastically lower global temperatures and push the world into a severe famine that could kill more than 250 million people. A total nuclear war could spell doom for the human race. This pressure puts the impetus on the countries with nuclear warheads to effectively communicate and create dependable information channels and assurances about nuclear non-proliferation. Otherwise, the Cold War nuclear growth could begin anew, with countries bolstering their nuclear capacities to prepare for the worst-case scenario in the name of dissuasion and public security. And after that, no states or countries will be left untouched. But what do you think? Is Putin building up for a nuclear war? Is the threat of nuclear war more realistic than during the Cold War? And what's the best way to survive should the bombs start flying? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and thank you for watching.
Throughout the 21st century, Russia and China's economic ties have openly deepened. However, the relationship between these two superpowers is a strenuous one, and it wouldn't take much to make them mortal enemies. What would it take? And if either of these two countries did attack each other, what would prompt them to do so? And who would win? While neither country is willing to admit the reality of their relationship, the signs are there. To understand them, we need to delve into their geopolitical histories. Both countries have long traditions rich in warfare and attempts to claim superiority in their respective regions. For Russia, that's the Great Eurasian Steppe. Russia's historical ties to the steppe can be traced back to its origins as an Eastern Slavic country. However, the geography of northeastern Europe is steeped in low-lying flatland that is incredibly difficult to defend against invaders due to its sheer size and exposure. And Russia has been on the receiving end of many invasions, with perhaps the most notable being the Napoleonic Wars. Although Russia fended off the French, it showcased the relative ease with which the European part of Russia could be attacked via the Germanic lands. That's why Russia has spent considerable resources to secure its European borders and relations, which came to a head in the 20th century with the USSR. Apart from being at its peak territorially, Russia held diplomatic ties with most of Eastern Europe through the Warsaw Pact, which elevated its influence over most of the Eurasian steppe. But the situation didn't last. With the USSR dissolving and many European countries joining the US-led NATO, Russia's borders of influence were equated to its actual borders, perilously close to the country's main population centers in Europe. China's territory has ebbed and flowed over the millennia. China's current policy seems focused on claiming parts of territories it has historically owned, including but not limited to Taiwan, parts of India in the Himalayas, and swathes of the South China Sea.
These territorial disputes have brought the US and several Indo-Pacific countries together to form the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, QSD or the Quad, to curb China's influence in the area. The main thorn in China's internal and external diplomacy is Taiwan, technically led by the Republic of China, which it considers a rebellious remnant of the country that needs to be brought back into the fold. However, Taiwan has the military and diplomatic backing of the US. If China decided to abandon diplomacy and invade Taiwan, it would be no doubt met by US-armed Taiwanese forces, with the rest of the Quad following close behind. This would likely create a prolonged war similar to the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Further complicating China's foreign policy is its robust yet fragile domestic industry. As a country with the second largest population on Earth, China is woefully lacking in natural resources to support that many people working and producing for the economy. China imports most of its oil and natural gas, as well as mineral, drinking water, and timber. What makes the US particularly dangerous to China's economy is the fact that most of its oil and natural gas supplies come through shipments from the Persian Gulf. Furthermore, a vast majority of this sea traffic has to pass through the tightly controlled Strait of Malacca. To salvage the situation, China claims most of the South China Sea, almost up to the strait itself, and opposes most other countries with access to the ocean. Still, if China decided to attack Taiwan or seriously try to control its portions of the South or East China Sea, it would no doubt be opposed by the Indo-Pacific countries. As a result, the strait would likely be shut off to Chinese vessels. This would cripple the Chinese resource-demanding economy and would likely result in the country's collapse as we know it, with unfathomable consequences for world politics. With opposition from all sides, it would seem natural that Russia and China would become allies, in an attempt to curb the American influence on its borders. NATO for Russia, the Quad for China. However, this is the point where history gets complex. You see, while China and Russia are currently presenting a united front against the US, their historical ties are more hostile than you might think. Even when both countries were communist in the mid-20th century, the regimes clashed over their interpretation of Marxism-Leninism. But the most contested Chinese-Russian relations are due to two treaties in the mid-19th century. During the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, Imperial China was under heavy political, diplomatic, and military pressure from colonial and foreign imperial forces, starting with the Opium Wars and ending with the country's reinvention as the Communist People's Republic of China. The 110 years of opposition from the West has been dubbed as the Century of Humiliation by the Chinese, with many politicians repeatedly citing all the losses China suffered during that period. As part of the Century of Humiliation, China was forced to sign several so-called unequal treaties, in which China had to cede parts of its territory, control, or other diplomatic material. With Russia in particular, the two most important treaties were the 1858 Treaty of Aigun and the 1860 Treaty of Peking, which resulted in China losing the province of Outer Manchuria. While Chinese officials claim that the province isn't a point of contention, reality begs to differ. The division made by the two treaties was somewhat ambiguous, resorting to using the two main rivers in the region, Amur and Ussuri, as borders between Russia and China. However, Russia claims that all the islands in the river belong to Russia, while China claims that the border goes through the middle of the rivers, assigning the islands to a country based on its location against the middle of the river. In fact, the entire area has been hotly contested by China. Even in the 20th century, a 7-month military conflict between the Chinese and the Russians took place over the contested islands, particularly the Zhenbao or Damansky Island on the Ussuri. The 2-week battle over Zhenbao resulted in hundreds of casualties on both sides and created more than 3.5 decades of tension over the islands. Furthermore, the sedimentary island, called Bolshoi Ussuriski Island or Haixazi Island, has also been a sore spot in China's history. It stands in the confluence of the rivers, right on the border between the two countries. Claims over the island's territory have been going on since the treaties. Eventually, the two countries ratified the control of the island in a 2004 agreement that split the island between them and permitted China to use the Amur and Ussur rivers for ship traffic. However, it seems China hasn't caught up to the agreement just yet. In a map published in 2023, China displayed the entirety of the Bolshoi Ussuriski Island as being under Chinese control. While this may have been an oversight, it could also mean that China has plans regarding the previously debated region. The island itself is an undeveloped piece of land and would be an afterthought were it not for its favorable geographical position. Lying at the confluence of Amur and Ussuri, the island is perilously close to Khabarovsk,
the second largest city in Outer Manchuria, which overlooks the island. Since Russia controls the portion of the island on the confluence of Amur and Ussuri, it can also control the shipping routes that are usable when the river isn't iced over. The Amur also has considerable hydroelectric and fishing capacity, something that China could greatly use due to its reliance on energy imports. Additionally, China's Ministry of Natural Resources has issued a statement relabeling cities and provinces in the Outer Manchuria region, which belongs to Russia, with Chinese names, usually historical ones from before the treaties. While it might seem that the region is relatively useless to China, you have to keep the bigger picture in mind. Outer Manchuria is one of the most populated and industrialized regions of the Russian Far East, with two cities having over 600,000 inhabitants, Khabarovsk and Vladivostok. The region is inhabited by around 4 million people, half of the entire Russian Far East population, compared to over 100 million people in the neighboring Chinese provinces. If war were to break out, China would have a massive initial manpower advantage, and the people could easily inhabit the sparsely populated Russian region after the fact. What makes Outer Manchuria a possible first front of the Sino-Russo War is also the aforementioned fact that China is a relatively resource-deprived nation. Since there are roughly 1 billion people in the country, China has a massive resource demand for energy, minerals, and even drinking water. Currently, most of the country, even though it contains some of the biggest rivers in the world, can barely produce enough to satisfy the population's need. Additionally, the biggest population center in the North China Plain has pretty much no natural drinking water supply, relying on the rest of the country and imports for its drinking water sources. As a result, China is looking for ready water supplies elsewhere, with two lucrative options: India and Russia. With pre-existing territorial disputes with India, China could potentially look into invading the water-rich Himalayan region it stakes a claim to. However, India itself houses the largest population in the world and faces a similar water scarcity problem, relying on the same region for drinking water. This makes the country much more defensive of the contested territory. Add to that the fact that India is in the Quad and also has beneficial trade relations with the West, and the US, Quad, and NATO would come down hard on China if it started an invasion on Indian soil. This leaves Russia as one of the key interest points for acquiring more resources. In terms of drinking water, Siberia is generally river-rich. However, by far the largest concentration of drinking water is in Lake Baikal, the biggest lake by volume, outstripping all Great Lakes combined, with estimates suggesting it could support the world population for decades by itself. In fact, a Chinese company aggressively purchased land around the lake in the 2010s, with plans to construct a pipeline and supply China with fresh water in 2017. The local population protested about the construction, and the Russian government intervened, forcing the Chinese company to abandon any plans to build up Lake Baikal. This doesn't mean that China will keel over. With its economy highly dependent on resources that it currently needs to import, and much of its oil and natural gas imports coming from either the Strait of Malacca or Russia itself, China might look to remove one of the middlemen from the equation. Since its south is bound in overseas territorial disputes and influenced by US foreign policies, Russia might be the next obvious choice. With Outer Manchuria as the entryway, China could gain access to the entire Siberian region, which is rich in oil, natural gas, minerals, timber, and water, all the resources the country desperately needs to function. Furthermore, with the Russian Far East so far removed from the population and influence centers in Europe, and the Russian army currently embroiled in its own war with Ukraine, China could consider invading Russia at any moment. This way, Beijing would gain the upper hand and succeed in a quick war, the kind Putin previously failed to accomplish in Ukraine 2 years prior. Remember, most of the issues that Russia is facing right now in Ukraine are due to intervention from NATO countries, the same issues that likely won't provide Russia with any assistance against China. However, a Chinese invasion might prompt the US and the Quad to exercise their own plans to cut off China in the south, possibly creating a chain reaction of war declarations similar to that of the World Wars. Additionally, Outer Manchuria, and the Siberian region by extension, would provide China with greater access to the Pacific coastline through the Sea of Japan or the Russian Pacific coastline itself. In fact, if China were determined to bring the entirety of the Russian Far East under its own control, it could gain access to the Arctic shore itself. This is vital for an entirely different reason. You see, the main shipping routes around Eurasia and Africa currently rely on the Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz, followed by the Strait of Malacca, to transport goods between Western Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Alternatively to the Suez-Hormuz line would be the Cape of Good Hope, southern Horn of Africa, a route that is around 4,000 nautical miles longer. But the Arctic contains a sea and a lot of ice that's navigable for at least a part of the year during warmer months when the ice cover is smaller. While the Arctic was previously relatively unused for maritime transport for that reason, global warming has changed the situation rapidly. A change of even a few degrees Celsius has been enough to drastically reduce the ice sheet over the Arctic Circle and open up previously inaccessible waters to ships. The Russian-controlled Northern Sea route is currently the biggest and the shortest trading route in the region, with the other option going through the Northwest route in Alaskan and Canadian waters. According to some studies, Arctic routes could be between 30 and 50% shorter, either in time spent at sea or distance, than those using the Suez or Panama canals, while eliminating the possible bottlenecks at the two artificial channels, a fact that became painfully obvious in the Evergreen incident in 2021. The tenuous geopolitics in Russia leave it open for influence from both the West, with which it is in a proxy war through Ukraine, and China, where it sells oil, gas, and other resources for the much-needed capital to fuel its economy and military efforts. The current situation plays well into China's hands, giving them unparalleled reach into Siberia through ongoing trade, all without actually needing to invest resources in invading the country or forcing Russia to accept the deal. With Russia stuck in a prolonged war it seemingly has no way of getting out of, it was forced to sell oil and gas to China at roughly half the rate it did to European countries. Naturally, this gives China a clear economic benefit from the Russo-Ukrainian war. As such, it works in China's favor to have Russia occupy the US and EU military efforts into Ukraine, while at the same time siphoning the resources it needs from Russia without resorting to trade through the Strait of Malacca. This has led to China famously not condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine and abstaining in any peace talks or dialogues to end the war in the region. It's quite clear that Putin's regime is working out well for China, and the country will likely remain a stern ally so long as the situation doesn't change. Furthermore, while the previous 2 years might have led everyone to believe Russia has a robust economy and is a veritable superpower in its own right, the truth is a bit more nuanced. Russia's population is roughly 1/10 of China's, and while the countries have a comparable GDP, gross domestic product, per capita, China's size gives it a clear edge. In fact, in current estimates, China is the world's second largest economy, while Russia makes it to 11th place by total GDP. The economic disparity and Russia's military, economic, and diplomatic losses that followed the invasion of Ukraine make any deals fall naturally in China's favor. So long as Russia is cut off from the rest of the world financially, it's forced to accept China's terms in order to sell its resources and power its economy. However, the melting Arctic ice might put a dent in that plan. If Russia were able to operate independent shipping year-round and impose tariffs on goods traveling through the northeast route, it could create a secondary stream of income and gain a semblance of economic independence from China. Additionally, just because Russia's current regime is favorable to China doesn't mean that the situation will stay that way. The war in Ukraine might be protracted, but it won't last forever, and Russia might reconsider its allegiance to China in the long run and cut off resource export to China from its Far East. Many experts believe that Russia doesn't have the military power to press further into Ukraine in 2024. With Ukraine steadily holding on to the support it receives from the EU and NATO, the war might be reaching a breaking point within the next few years. While there are a few possibilities on how the war will end, one of the predictions is that Russia's current regime will collapse. This will pave the way for a different leadership, with a potentially revolutionary outlook on Russia's long-term future in both Europe and Asia. The leadership might align itself more with Europe, China, or a third party altogether, and some of those scenarios might stop it from playing right into China's hands. If Russia does end up weakened enough from the Ukrainian war or start opposing its ongoing trade with China, then China wouldn't have many options left. Since the current regime under Xi is fervently opposed to the influence radiating from the US onto the Indo-Pacific, the resource-starved Chinese will need to obtain more goods from its north, i.e. Russia. This circles back to the seemingly solved dispute between Russia and China on the matter of which country controls parts of Outer Manchuria. While China has gained back most of the territories it lost during the century of humiliation, the provinces of Outer Manchuria are still under Russian control. Given that China is still pressing claims on areas it had long lost any legal ties on and are loosely historically connected to China, such as the claims in the South China Sea, it's highly likely to reverse course on its previous agreements with Russia and claim back the lost provinces in Manchuria. Considering the present economic and demographic inequality between the regions separated by the Amur and Ussuri, China's invasion would likely be swift and deadly. In all likelihood, it would displace or culturally assimilate the Russians in the area before reinforcements from the European parts of Russia could arrive. Since the area is already starting to be influenced by China due to ongoing trade, it's also possible that China might imitate the Russian annexation of Crimea to gain access to the Japanese Sea. Alternatively, it might begin its advance into the rest of the Russian Far East. In essence, what is currently happening in Ukraine could be repeated. In the way Russia wants to diversify its port access and limit the influence of other countries on its economy, China could do the same thing in the future to Russia. With Russia weakened from the war, it's unlikely to remain the world's 11th economy for long and will likely be shattered by conflicting ideologies from within. That would leave Russia underpopulated, underrepresented, and underdeveloped. Yet the resource-rich and highly lucrative Far East will be ripe for the taking by the country that stands to gain the most from utilizing those resources: China. The only question that remains is how China will actually attack Russia. While China's current policy is non-interference, the country could reverse that course and try to sponsor a deal between Russia and Ukraine. During peace accords, China may impose its own influence on both Russia and Ukraine, forcing either country to accept whatever terms China deems best for its own agenda. In exchange, China would fund reconstruction and reinvigoration efforts in the war-struck areas of Ukraine. On the surface, the EU would likely welcome this deal, as Ukraine's reconstruction efforts are most likely going to be funded by the EU. Talks about the country joining the EU in an expedited process have been underway for some time. This would also suit China's plans to undercut the US influence around the world. If the EU doesn't have to support yet another country and can rely on Chinese-brought infrastructure in Ukraine, the US doesn't have as much leverage. While the EU is currently importing Norwegian and American oil and gas, the end of the Russo-Ukrainian war could drastically change the trading routes on a global scale. With Russia free to resume exporting oil and gas to Europe, the US will lose one of its biggest export partners. It's currently unknown whether Russia can actually satisfy the needs of both China and the EU, but China could support the trade if it retains its influence on Russian politics and economy. Even if China doesn't create a lucrative offer to end the Russo-Ukrainian war, it could end the war forcefully by pulling the plug on economically supporting Russia. While Russia would likely retaliate by cutting off the resources from Siberia, China could open up claims to Outer Manchuria as a proxy. By invading Russia, it can take hold of the resources itself and cut out the middleman from the equation. Before long, China could feasibly gain access to the Sea of Japan, or even freezing Siberian ports in the Arctic, allowing it to bypass the Strait of Malacca and place its products directly into Western Europe. In the end, while Russia and China's current stance is that the countries have an alliance, in actuality, Russia is only a few steps away from becoming China's vassal or being attacked by China's numerically superior forces while being completely unprotected from Europe. Then it's up to China to decide what claims it would pursue, and to the US and the rest of the Quad to determine how to proceed in creating a new world order. It should be mentioned that all of these scenarios are only rough approximations or conjectures. Each one is based on the current events in Russia, Ukraine, and the geopolitics surrounding the China-US rivalry in the Indo-Pacific. If something drastically changes in the foreign policies of either of the parties, China could be facing a much worse war against the entirety of the US and the Quad before it strikes against Russia. But what do you think? Is China going to attack Russia, or is it still too afraid of American countermeasures? In the event China does attack, will it press far into Siberia or settle by regaining the region of Outer Manchuria? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content from military experts.